Chapter 566. Keaton was the most famous county king in the empire. Because he had the closest blood relationship with the great emperor, he was able to snatch the most beautiful women around him. The citizens of the county star under his rule had the worst life. His fierce face was the ugliest, especially when he smiled. For example, right now, he was holding a glass of wine. His face was red from drunkenness, and his fish eyes were full of excitement. His fingers were deep in the chubby cheeks of his blonde secretary. His smile was so smug and cruel. In order to celebrate His Majesty's great victory, should I find a few more virgins after the celebration? He drank a mouthful of blood-like red wine and planned the rest of the trip with satisfaction. The woman in his arms had a mesmerizing figure and blonde hair. Unfortunately, the color of her eyes was too light. As a pure-blooded member of the empire's royal family, he was proud of his dark and ugly eyes. Of course, he was not happy about this. Every time this county king led an army, it was always a cruel slaughter and a journey full of obscene activities. However, this time, the interdimensional hunting plan was extremely important, so he had to put in all his effort and be very careful. Not to mention, there was still that little ancestor on the ship. The nobles of Tianjing planet and the officials of the county star were afraid of his rudeness and prominent status, but in reality, they looked down on him. However, this person used his brutality to wipe out the rebellions of the common people for His Majesty again and again. He also gained His Majesty's trust with his straightforward and violent temper. No one dared to show this emotion on the surface. County King Carlton was very clear about the views of the entire empire's upper class. He knew that countless people hated this ugly and evil mask on his face. Although this mask was not something he wanted to wear, he didn't mind because His Majesty needed him to wear it, the empire needed him to wear it, and his power and status also needed him to wear it. He had worn it for too long and was addicted to it. Gradually, he was very happy wearing it and forgot that the brutality was a mask given by His Majesty or his own nature. Many years ago, when he left Tianjing planet for the first time and took the warship to a remote star region to suppress the rebellion, he gradually liked this feeling. He liked to watch those unsatisfied lowlifes tremble in front of the Empire's armored troops with crude self-made weapons, their faces pale, their feces flowing, and they scattered like a bunch of animals. Among the similar beautiful memories, there was also that year, those federal prisoners, those fat maggots that kept wriggling on the wounds of the foreigners, the painful howls of the foreigners until they groaned softly, and in the end, they died silently like garbage. But from now on, there was probably nothing else that could make him tremble with excitement and enjoy the supreme climax of his spirit than the scene of the ancient clock ship's explosion a few days ago. I don't want to be recorded in the history of the Empire. I just hope that my position in His Majesty's heart will be more stable, and I will be able to allocate more resources to my army. Keaton thought with satisfaction. He laughed and squeezed the woman's buttocks. He seemed to see a beautiful scene in front of him. A short and sharp cry rang out. It was not the female civil official whose buttocks were bruised and swollen that cried out in pain, but the warship's central control system automatically sent out an alarm. The Imperial soldiers in the central control room of the warship looked at each other in surprise. The officer in charge of the electronic monitoring shook his head in confusion. There was an alarm, but the data filtering program of the warship's monitoring system did not indicate the source of the alarm. Because of this reason, like most of his subordinates, Keaton did not raise his vigilance enough. Except for official military exercises, the Empire's fleet in the local star region had not sent out an alarm for more than 10 years. Could it be that some stupid electronic technician accidentally touched some device? However, only 10 seconds later, the short and sharp alarm rang again. This time, the warship system indicated the source of the danger. The cold mechanical voice echoed in the room, "Unknown target is approaching at high speed, distance 2,322 kilometers, direction deviation 83 degrees, Keaton's face slightly darkened. He frowned and looked at his subordinate, who finally woke up and started to quickly analyze the alarm. The captain wiped the cold sweat on his forehead and ran over, nervously reporting, "The unknown flying object is very small. Because it is in the background of the bright star, we can't confirm its shape yet. But its shape is obviously irregular, so it should be a small meteorite. Please don't worry, the warship has started to adjust its posture, and the relevant reinforcement plates have been covered." As if mocking the intelligence and calculation ability of the carbon-based life in the warship, 3 seconds later, the central control computer of the warship sent out a sharp alarm again. "Target distance 779 kilometers, speed, warning, impact warning, warning, impact warning, please return to your seats and stabilize your body." 1 second later, the content of the central control computer of the warship became, "Target distance 277 kilometers, speed." Hearing this, Keaton, who had a disgusted but relaxed expression, suddenly stood up and stared at the light beam with his gloomy eyes. He did not know if there was a small meteorite in space that had such a shocking speed, but he was absolutely sure that even if there was such a small meteorite, small meteorites would not slow down. However, with a gloomy expression, he did not have time to say anything. The alarm of the central control system of the warship could not even keep up with the speed of the meteorite. After a muffled sound, the floor of the warship that was sailing smoothly slightly trembled, as if it was hit by a small object. Everyone subconsciously looked up and followed the surveillance camera of the warship in confusion and shock, looking at the location of the impact. With one look, many of the officers of Dynasty could not help but let out a gasp. Because they saw in the vast image of space, on the lonely outer shell of the warship, a black Federation new model mechanical suit appeared. The surroundings were dead silent, but the unpleasant sound of metal colliding was still echoing in the cockpit. The MXT smashed into the upper hull of the Dynasty's battleship like a meteor. Although it was forced to decelerate in the last 1,000 kilometers with the help of the propulsion system, such a violent collision would still mercilessly take away the pilot's life. However, the muscle fibers and bone joints in Sue Lee's body, along with the mysterious cultivation method taught by the uncle and his incomparably diligent training, had become incomparably tough, and had actually withstood the terrifying instantaneous time that was instantly overloaded by 30 times. Uncle George Carlin had once said, "The human body is the #1 machine." Then today, Sue Lee's body was undoubtedly on the path to becoming a powerful metal machine. With a slight ringing in his ears, he did not have the time to admire the Federal Central Computer's orbit calculation ability, nor did he pay attention to the vacuum outside the cockpit that was still extremely cold even under the blazing light of the stars. He only typed in an operation command as fast as he could. Shang Chiu and the Nutshell Engineering Department had specially designed the MXT mechanical suit, which still retained some of the weird design of the little white flower years ago. Following Sue Lee's input, the super alloy plate on the left chest of the MXT mechanical suit suddenly opened, and a mechanical repair arm that glowed with a metallic light quickly extended out. The tool at the front of the slender mechanical repair arm was like a human's finger. The moment it came into contact with a certain metal part of the outer hull of the Imperial warship, it began to hum and rotate rapidly. The weak electric sparks produced by the forceful connection of countless circuits flashed in the vacuum. Without the support of the main cannons, it would be extremely difficult for that lone black MXT mecha to forcefully blast through the super thick alloy shield of the Imperial battleship in the middle of the vast universe. Furthermore, this specially made MXT mecha had already been stripped of most long-range heavy firepower weapons in order to maximize Sue Lee's control advantage. Therefore, he did not plan to blast a large hole in this Imperial warship before crawling in. Instead, he planned to use tools to open this warship from the front, just like a thief trying to pick a lock. Only, this thief, the Black MXT, had already exposed himself. The blueprints and related data of the Imperial battleship previously entered by the Federation central mainframe flipped through rapidly in Sue Lee's mind. He needed to kill his way in before the Imperial battleship could react, otherwise those terrifying battleships that were still charging around his mecha would cross-fire on their own, directly blasting him and his mecha into smithereens or sinking them into the darkness of space. The black MXT was like a gecko, sticking closely to the terrifyingly wide hull of the target warship. Sparks flew everywhere, and it only existed in the vacuum for an extremely short period of time before silently disappearing. 3 seconds. In just 3 short seconds, 3 seconds that left all the Imperial soldiers on the warship dumbfounded and speechless, the black MXT successfully non-violently removed the thick alloy plate. Amidst the heroic atmosphere of the murderous atmosphere around him, the black MXT dashed in a flash. "I'll kill him." As the black MXT entered the Imperial warship at high speed, Sula spoke very seriously into the communication system. Data and annotations from the central computer of the Federation flashed in his pure black left pupil now and then. Following the data and annotations, Sula maneuvered the mecha forward at a high speed and found an inconspicuous cover of the connection assembly. After breaking it open, he cut off the preliminary surveillance sensors in the relevant areas of the Imperium's warship. The Federal Central Computer had been researching the Imperial warship for almost 100 years and had collected a huge amount of data. Furthermore, it had supercomputing power that the Imperial people were envious of and terrified of. Therefore, even though the warships of the Imperial Ghost Fleet were specially modified to withstand the storm in the space passage and to hunt down the ancient bell, he could still accurately guess the design ideas of the Imperial Academy of Science. From there, he could provide specific data and suggestions for Sula to launch a surprise attack. Under the guidance of the Federal Central Computer's supercomputing power, Suli's mechanical engineering talent was also displayed to its fullest. The tall and heavy black MXT nimbly dodged around the Imperial warship and found a second position. It quickly dug open an alloy valve, and with a flick of its mechanical arm, it accurately installed a device. Every movement was so concise and beautiful, it was like an enlarged version of when he was focused on mechanical engineering. From the time he broke into the warship until now, the second hand of the Universal Standard Clock had moved 17 times. The internal defense system of the Imperial warship had been fully activated, but not a single Imperial soldier could stop him, and not a single Imperial mech could surround him crazily. Chapter 567. Under the effect of the pressure difference, the air in the upper layer of the Empire's battleship was ejected out of the ship at high speed. The roaring wind cut through the cockpit and then disappeared. In the next moment, the black MXT also turned into a violent wind in the upper layer of the battleship. The heavy and enormous alloy body suddenly moved, easily avoiding the restraining belts that popped out from the internal partition of the battleship. Pulling out a high-speed afterimage, it passed through the long covered bridge and rushed towards the dim patio passageway. Then, it jumped down from the platform that was more than 10 meters below the entrance of the passageway. The jump was so clean and neat, without any hesitation. Looking at the Federation mecha's strange figure rolling in the air on the surveillance screen, the Empire officers who were mobilizing heavy firepower infantry to chase after the intruder felt a chill in their hearts for no reason. A loud boom sounded. The black MXT's heavy mechanical leg stomped fiercely on the platform. The partition that was made from the super alloy keel of the Empire's battleship was easily torn into pieces by the tremendous force of the impact. Amidst the flying dust and debris, the MXT was like a fallen devil. It fell even lower, as if it was about to enter the lowest level of hell on the floor where the Empire's battleship command room was located. A thick and solid steel beam was forcefully broken from the middle. It charged towards both sides at an extremely fast speed, piercing into the thick imitation battleship partition wall and letting out 2 chilling popping sounds. The mechanical leg that was full of diamond-shaped anti-skid patterns, as soon as it broke this steel beam and stepped firmly on the ground, it trembled fiercely again and forcefully bounced up again. It rushed straight ahead, turning into a gray shadow. The entire movement was done in one breath, calmly in the rapid and high-speed environment. This scene was like a graceful young girl wearing a white veil lightly tapping on the lotus in the pond with her bare right foot. She floated forward, the dewdrops on the petals gradually falling, but they didn't drip into the green water. However, this was an extremely heavy military mech, yet it was able to make such swift and gentle evasive movements. The Imperial officers who were staring at the surveillance screen could not believe their eyes. They roared in panic and fear, ordering the troops in the warship to catch up as soon as possible. The twin engines of the Black MXT mecha were operating at full power, the low rumble of its engines turning somewhat sharp and piercing at this moment. The unique pale blue particle light of the turbulence device at the back of the mecha gushed out, propelling the heavy body of the mecha forward with a roar. With one leap, the mecha forcefully broke through two Imperial lines of defense and entered a tunnel at high speed. The height of this passageway was only 5 meters, and the high-speed black mecha was almost 7 meters tall. Although the mecha maintained its forward diving posture, the highest point of the mecha still slammed hard into the ceiling of the passageway. Like a rough steel axe cutting through a smooth piece of paper, the ceiling above the tunnel was torn open with a crashing sound, leaving behind a ghastly hole. The mecha's SCC system and some of its miniature surveillance equipment were damaged to a certain extent in this fierce and somewhat reckless high-speed charge. However, Sulu, who was in the cockpit, did not care about this at all. In the dim lighting, one could see the young body under the ultra-thin simulation system trembling slightly. His exposed thin lips were slightly pale, but he did not move at all. He stared at the image that appeared on the screen and the continuously scrolling light dots indicating the structure diagram. His eyes were narrowed very much, but his pupils were very bright. That's a dead end. Block him there. The Imperial officer in the command room of the warship did not understand why that fierce Federation mecha would charge into that dead-end tunnel like a rat in a panic. He shouted loudly in ecstasy. Sulu narrowed his eyes as he stared at the wall on the screen that was getting closer and closer. The burning lines in his body flowed quickly, and every pair of muscle fibers began to tremble. It was not that he had used all his strength, but that he felt some kind of excitement. Was a dead end really a dead end? He had never believed in this. It was just like that famous road on the outskirts of the capital city. If there really was no road, then he would open one himself. Walking his own road did not mean that the enemy had no road to walk, but he would always be able to find his own way out of a dead end. The Black MXT did not slow down. Instead, it sped up and charged towards the heavy isolation wall at the end of the tunnel. The Darlin machine cannon at the front of the left mechanical arm blasted out beautiful gunfire, blasting countless holes and terrifying splinters into the wall. Meanwhile, its right mechanical arm ejected a sharp special alloy blade. In the instant that the mecha crashed heavily into the thick wall, countless sharp flashes of the blade abruptly burst forth. A wave of ear-numbing and brain-numbing screeches rang out, the sound of metal scraping against hard objects. A strange cloud of dust had yet to disperse at the end of the tunnel, but the black mecha was already incomparably valiant, charging over without reason. Behind the thick wall was an alloy door. The black mecha broke through it. Behind the door, there was another thick isolation wall. The black mecha broke through it. Inside the complex structure of the Empire's battleship, the black mecha, which looked a bit small in comparison, was no longer as unpredictable as a ghost. Instead, it turned into a mountain-splitting axe, unreasonably attacking in a straight line. For a moment, no one knew what this mecha was trying to do. Apart from Sulu and the old guy in the tri-winged warship 7,000 kilometers above the Imperium's fleet like a ghost, nobody could figure out their plan. Relying on the sensitive equipment on the MXT, the central computer of the Federation had been deducing and confirming the relevant structural plans of the Imperium's warship and calculating the possible deployment of the enemy's forces. More than 10 seconds ago, it finally found a path. This path was a straight path. A dead end that led straight to the core area of the Empire's battleship. A path that led to the death of Duke Carlton. The powerful Black MXT, under Sue Lee's almost crazy control, continued to break through like this. After breaking through 3 walls and 4 doors, it finally arrived at the destination of his journey, or rather, the location of the mission. The strange sound of air currents exploding suddenly rang out. The wall was like a brittle, air-dried synthetic skin, shattering piece by piece and then collapsing to the ground. The Black MXT mecha entered at high speed from the outside of the hole and landed heavily on the ground. Right now, the Black mecha's exterior was already covered in wounds. It was a horrible sight, full of dust and rocks, but it still looked like an inviolable god. The command center of the battleship had been filled with shouts of panic, anger, and orders. Following the unbelievable appearance of this Black mecha, all of them suddenly stopped. Hundreds of Imperial officers stared at this Federation mecha in disbelief, shocked speechless. Right now, the tri-wing battleship that was 7,000 kilometers above the Empire's battleship slowly adjusted its position. The Federal Central Computer that was automatically controlling the tri-wing battleship started to prepare for the high-speed dive that was about to start. For some reason, the existence of this logic program felt a very strange data flow phenomenon. Maybe it was emotions. The Federal Central Computer thought that what it was about to do was similar to Sue Lee's crazy mecha running, so it was a bit excited. Duke Carlton, who had been staring at the screen with a pale face, suddenly turned around and stared at the Federation mecha in shock. The surveillance system of the battleship couldn't keep up with the speed of this Federation mecha at all. Who was the person inside this mecha? Most importantly of all, how could he find the channel that led to the command center so easily and freely inside his own warship when he himself had not figured it out yet? Chapter 568. Duke Carlton looked at the Black Federation mecha that broke through the wall and immediately deduced that the opponent must be the Federation soldier in the small battleship they saw before they entered the space tunnel. But the opponent only had one spaceship. How dare he chase after him to kill him? This world was truly crazy and ridiculous. A mocking and contemptuous smile began to spread through the gaps between the muscles on his face. From his point of view, this Black mecha had the guts to enter the Empire's star sector, and to break into the flagship when no one expected it to come right in front of him. It did show extraordinary combat ability, but it was still just a pitiful lunatic. The Empire had prepared this hunting plan for almost 2 years. Countless people had worked hard to achieve this goal. Did this Federation soldier in the Black mech really think that by using the courage that was stirred up by anger and the time that he had bought with his madness and sacrifice in battle, he would be able to learn from the Empire's plan and kill himself to avenge that damned tiger? The sharp sirens and flashing warning lights mixed together. The debris on the wall of the command hall was still flying in the air. The muffled noises that came from all directions were like the most heavy drum beat in a symphony. The heavy isolation doors at the outermost edge of the Empire's flagship were all physically closed under the command of the core electronic code of the system. From this moment on, this Federation mecha that brazenly killed its way into the interior of the battleship was like a trapped beast locked in a metal cage, unable to escape. A mecha. Duke Carlton laughed arrogantly. He put his arm around the beautiful blonde civil official's waist and walked towards the escape door that just opened, ready to leave. In order to hunt down the ancient bell, the mechas on the battleships all left the ship to fight. In the end, they all turned into mecha bombs and disappeared into the universe. They paid a terrible price. But in order to protect Duke Carlton and a certain noble who had been hiding his identity, the mechas on the flagship didn't move until now. Only now did they stand out. 2 ace mecha pilots from the Empire's royal family and 3 of the strongest mecha masters under Duke Carlton's command controlled 5 new Wolf Fang mechas and coldly blocked the front line in the middle of the command room. They escorted the Duke away and then prepared to capture or destroy the Black Federation mecha. Because they were on a warship, the 5 terrifyingly shaped Wolf-Fang mecha did not use any heavy firepower weapons. However, what puzzled them was that for some reason, the Federation Black mecha charging towards them had also given up on using long-range weapons. After the Black MXT broke through the wall and killed its way into the command hall of the Empire's battleship, only 2 seconds passed. In these 2 seconds, the 5 Empire mechas just set up their defense formation, and the soldiers in the command hall just raised their guns. In these 2 seconds, the excellent brain under Duke Cotton's rough appearance made a quick judgment. He said one sentence, sneered 3 times, reached out his right hand, lifted his left leg, turned his body slightly, and was ready to leave. In the same 2 seconds, the Black MXT controlled by Su Luk seemed to be forced to slow down and was about to stop, but in reality, it didn't stop its heavy mechanical footsteps. It didn't even stand there and yell at the butcher general who was about to leave. Unlike the time on the snowfield, his goal today was much simpler. It was to kill and avenge, not to destroy the machine and establish his might. On the only road calculated by the central computer of the Federation, he had charged so fiercely and fiercely. If he had to stop and strike a few postures after entering the hall to cast a few demeanor statues, it would be an extremely stupid action. This was Su Li's understanding, so the Black MXT rushed over silently without any hesitation. The Black and Green Empire's Wolf-Fang mecha made a few whooshing sounds and flew up. In the relatively small space of the command hall, the Wolf-Fang mecha made a few strange sounds and pounced towards him fiercely. No matter how one looked at it, the Black Federation mecha that looked a bit tattered had no chance of surviving under the combined attack of 5 Wolf-Fang mechas. However, in the Wolf-Fang mecha at the very front, the ace mecha pilot from the Tianjing Royal Mecha Battalion looked at the enemy on the screen and suddenly felt a strange coldness around his neck. This was the instinct for danger on the battlefield that only a strong fighter who had been through hundreds of battles could possess. This pilot's pupils constricted. Because he could not pinpoint where the danger was, he was on high alert. His hand speed exploded as he controlled the Wolf-Fang mecha with excellent movement performance to attack fiercely. A series of light and hurried sounds rang out from outside the cockpit. The high-speed Wolf-Fang mecha suddenly paused, pausing miserably in midair. Blood flowed out from the corner of the Empire mecha pilot's mouth, but he didn't bother to wipe it away. He looked at the empty screen in horror. He didn't know how that Federation mecha had managed to avoid his attack just now. What made him feel even more disbelief and despair was the deep crack that had appeared at the bottom corner of the cockpit. The sharp metal tip had pierced in through this crack, only less than 10 centimeters away from his body. It had pierced into the cockpit, causing sparks to fly everywhere. It was a complete mess. That black mecha had actually pierced through the super alloy armor outside his cockpit with one strike. The Wolf-Fang mecha's body was smaller than that of the Federation MX mecha. Coupled with its high speed and nimble movement performance, it was like a carnivorous monkey chasing its prey in the forest. The scene of the 5 Wolf-Fang mecha pouncing towards the Black XT-MT carried with it a trace of blood and savagery. It was abnormally terrifying. However, no one would have thought that the next scene would actually be like this. The moment the Black MXT was about to be attacked by the enemy, it began to tremble. Every component and spherical joint on the mecha's body began to tremble at a high frequency. Suddenly, the sound of metal colliding rang out like a torrential downpour. It looked like it was about to fall apart. However, it didn't fall apart. On the contrary, following this strange high-frequency trembling, the 2 thick mechanical legs of the Black MXT silently evaded at high speed, moving the seemingly clumsy mecha to create a series of afterimages in the narrow space. With a deafening boom, the Black MXT, facing the 5 Wolf-Fang mechas, actually relied on its sudden burst of high speed to counterattack. Its heavy right mechanical leg swung out violently, striking the Wolf-Fang mecha on the right with a stunning kick he had learned on the ancient bell. The kick landed squarely on the Wolf Fang mecha on the right. Almost at the same time, the right mechanical arm of the black MXT twisted strangely, passing right in front of its own cockpit. The sharp alloy blade at the front of the mechanical arm stabbed towards the other Wolf Fang mech closest to it. This stab was silent, but it gave off a ghostly and unstoppable feeling. It completely ignored any of the opponent's controls, and simply stabbed into the opponent's cockpit with a pft sound. In just an instant, the black MXT mecha had kicked one Wolf Fang mecha away, and pierced another one. Before the remaining 3 Wolf Fang mecha could react, the black MXT mecha trembled violently like a crazy woman with long hair, and stirred up a gust of wind in the hull. It roared and tore through the air, and rushed behind Duke Carlton, who was quickly leaving, in the Federation space on the other side of the space tunnel, on the tri-winged spaceship that was silently preparing for revenge. Sula seriously looked at all the last data that the ancient Bell had sent back. Especially those new Empire mechas that had the ability to fight off-ship for a long time, they became his main research targets. Through the data, he confirmed that the new Empire mecha also used multi-engine technology. It was just that the other party couldn't solve the problem that the Federation also encountered back then, so they forcibly miniaturized the engines and installed them in the joints of the mecha's components in hopes that this new mecha would be able to obtain powerful maneuverability and evasive ability in battle. In the past few years, both parties had been researching new mechas. In this arms race, the Federation was slightly ahead, but because of the overwhelming advantage of the MX mecha against the Imperial Expeditionary Force on the battlefield in the West Woods, the Empire also sped up their pace to catch up. According to the old man's calculations, the technical parameters and maneuverability of the Wolf Fang mecha were almost the same as the Federation's MX mecha. In terms of evasive ability in small spaces, the Empire even had the advantage. Sulu had to admit that the Empire's Wolf Fang mecha's design concept was a little unorthodox, but it did greatly improve its performance. In the future, it would be very difficult for him to use the absolute advantage of the mecha's performance to brutally suppress the Empire like he did in the West Woods, but since he dared to use a black MXT to attack the Empire's flagship, other than his habitual fearlessness, he naturally had something to rely on. According to his analysis, the Wolf Fang mecha's maneuverability was indeed frightening, but those miniaturized engines installed in the joints of the components, once fully activated, would pose a very big problem for the mecha's operation. At full power, the Wolf Fang mech was like a sports car with an engine installed on every wheel. Of course, it could move as fast as the wind, but the brakes were still the same as before. Under the strong inertia, it would be difficult to stop as gently as the wind. The Empire's pilots would have to divert a lot of energy to deal with the high speed of the Wolf Fang mecha. For Sulu, this was the most important advantage. The advantage of the MXT mecha's performance had been reduced, so as long as he widened the gap in control, he could still play unreasonably. Thus, the Wolf Fang mecha, which had been tumbling in the air, could not understand how it had flown up. Thus, the Wolf Fang mecha, which was about to release black smoke from the cockpit hole, could not understand how a simple stab from the MXT had been able to pierce through its sturdiest reinforced alloy armor. That was because the trembling Su-Lo controlled the trembling black MXT. The speed of the right mechanical leg was already beyond the imagination of a normal person. As for that simple stab, in fact, in that instant, the black MXT had stabbed 7 times in a row. This kind of high-frequency, precise microcontrol was already difficult to describe using the concept of hand speed. In fact, after he had been disappointed and failed consecutively to reach level 6 in the H1 section of UA University Library, he, who had gradually grown stronger, had never tested the so-called hand speed and reaction speed again. Those mecha tests from the Empire were no longer an awkward mountain for him to climb over. Now, he had even almost completely forgotten the concept of hand speed. The black mecha rushed behind Duke Carlton. At this moment, all the Empire people were dumbfounded. Other than the remnants of the battle sound waves in the command center, there was only dead silence. The 3 wolf Fong mechas that were left behind seemed to be fixed in place by some mysterious force. The blonde female civil servant had a shocked expression on her face. Her mouth was wide open and scarlet, and her eyes were filled with fear. "Ah!" The woman hugged her head and screamed in terror, finally waking up the frozen time and space. The wolf Fong mech that was sent flying by the black MXT fell heavily to the ground, rolling helplessly towards the wall with an unpleasant sound of friction, crushing 2 Imperial officers to death in the process. Duke Carlton struggled to turn his head around. The shadow of the huge black mecha occupied his entire vision. His muscles were trembling slightly, and he looked like he was about to cry and laugh at the same time. His lips were slightly opened as if he wanted to say something. Before he could completely turn around, before he could say a word, even if it was his last words, with the sound of electric current, the tall black MXT raised its mechanical leg and stepped on the ground in the shadow in front of it. With a light thud, the huge and heavy metal mechanical foot pressed down on Duke Carlton's head and stomped him to the ground. Then, the foot lightly turned to the left and right, as if it was stomping an insignificant bug to death. The guy under the mecha's foot must have been turned into a meat patty. The muscles on the opponent's face must have become the wrinkles on the meat patty. However, Sula didn't feel disgusted. Instead, he controlled the heavy mechanical leg to turn left and right again to make sure that the opponent was dead. He was in a state of excitement that he had never felt before. In the short 3 seconds after he killed his way into the Empire's warship lobby, it wasn't the most powerful attack the Black MXT had ever made, but it was the most powerful attack he had ever made in his life. Those 5 Wolf Fong mecha were indeed difficult to deal with. Only by channeling all of his power through the simulated reality system in an instant, pushing his state to the limit, could he break through the opponent's defenses so easily, killing Keaton before he could escape. Now that Carlton was dead, this excitement didn't subside. Instead, it became even stronger. After he knew that the ancient bell was attacked, he had been in an extreme state of sadness, depression, and anger. But because he suppressed it under his silent appearance, he let these emotions seep into his bones. At this moment, those extremely negative emotions suddenly drilled out from every bone in his body and were released through his pores. It felt wonderful. "Fuck you. Die." In the dim cockpit, Sulu, who was sweating profusely, stared at the picture on the hologram. His lips trembled as he cursed. Then, he waved his fist. It had only been less than 24 hours since he decided to do this crazy thing in the tri-winged warship at the other end of the space tunnel to actually kill the other party. This hearty revenge was indeed a race against time from morning to night. Chapter 569. Even though his body was still intact, he still died in an even more horrible and bloody way. Even until his last thought turned into a few dots of light at the end of the black tunnel, he still couldn't figure out what had happened. He had just climbed to the peak of his life, but the great creator didn't even give him a day to enjoy it. A black mecha fell from the sky and ended his life so easily. The soldiers in the command center of the battleship couldn't understand it either. Did Duke Carlton just die like that? Would the enraged His Majesty make the entire fleet die with his brothers? Looking at the blood flowing out from the Black Federation mecha's feet, they were scared out of their wits. Their faces were pale, and they didn't dare to imagine what would happen next. Kill him. The furious and desperate roars of the soldiers of the Empire sounded inside the battleship. 4 wolf mechas and heavy firepower infantrymen rushed toward the black MXT crazily. Before the soldiers of the Empire could react, the black MXT pulled back its feet, turned around, and brushed past a wolf mecha. It didn't want to fight anymore. It simply backed off at high speed, turned into a black gust of wind, and crawled into the hole in the wall of the command center. Sulu knew what kind of crazy attack he was going to face. Killing a prominent Duke Carlton, a member of the royal family who was favored by the emperor, would definitely infuriate the people of the Empire. More importantly, the Empire tried to use the result of ambushing the Ancient Bell and killing Commander Zhong to boost the morale of the soldiers of the Federation. However, in the shortest amount of time, he had slashed the face of the Empire with a bloody knife. He didn't doubt that after the other battleships of the Empire confirmed that Duke Cotton was killed by him, they would do anything to kill him. Even if they had to destroy this flagship, the people of the Empire wouldn't allow him, the murderer, to escape from the Empire. The damaged SEC system was constantly combing and filtering the electronic signals around him. It was extremely complicated and dense. In the dim cockpit, he stared at the data feedback that was quickly flashing through the hologram with a pale face. He held the joystick with one hand and quickly tapped on the touch screen with the other. The simulation system magnified every minute muscle reaction in his body into the movements of the mecha. Under the triple control, the black MXT covered in debris was like a ferocious black monster, rampaging through the wide and narrow corridors of the battleship, avoiding the almost suicidal heavy firepower of the Empire's people in the battleship, maintaining an absolute high speed as it rushed towards the predetermined exit. The three-winged battleship of the Federation that was floating thousands of kilometers above the Empire's fleet slowly started to move. The three-winged battleship that was not controlled by anyone moved silently like a ghost. Then, it instantly accelerated. Under the direct physical control of the Federal Central Computer, it turned into a beam of light and rushed downward. According to the plan, when Sulu rushed out of the battleship into space, the three-winged battleship had to appear in the designated area. Then, in a very short amount of time, the three-winged battleship had to successfully capture the black MXT and avoid the fierce long-range firepower of the Empire's battleship. Retreating was the most difficult part of the whole plan. Could Sulu and that old guy do it? Sulu controlled the black MXT and sprinted like a madman. He sprinted all the way to the upper side of the battleship. The heavy mech trampled on the ground, slamming into all the obstacles in front of it. It was a race against time. In the most dangerous moment, the pair of small eyes in the dim cockpit grew brighter and brighter. He, who had not had a shred of confidence before, felt his confidence increase after successfully killing that butcher general. His tired body released the last of its strength. He did not doubt that he could successfully escape, and he did not doubt the old guy's calculation ability either. At the end of the straight corridor was the thick metal outer wall of the battleship. It was a dead end, but in Su Li's eyes, that was his path of survival. The left shoulder of the black MXT flipped open with a snap. The only long-range main cannon that the Nutshell Engineering Department had left for him fired with a boom. It blasted directly into that seemingly thick part, but in fact, was the weakest part of the entire Empire's battleship. Smoke and dust from the explosion scattered everywhere, and then were instantly sucked in by the vacuum outside the battleship. A strong wind blew in the straight corridor, and a large hole was blasted in the outer wall at the end of the corridor. It was the complete opposite of the crazy battle scene inside the battleship. Outside the hole was the eternal beauty of the starry sky. In the cockpit of the mecha, Sulu, who had been silently running all the way, realized that he could actually complete the almost impossible revenge plan. He finally couldn't help but scream in excitement. His right hand quickly and firmly pressed the black button on the control stick. The black MXT seemed to be infected by his emotions. It trembled violently, and its speed increased a bit, heading straight for that large black hole in the outer wall of the battleship. As he pressed the black button on the control stick, a violent explosion occurred in the upper layer of the Empire's battleship. After forcibly breaking into the battleship, the KY sticky high-energy bomb he had placed at the connecting valve of the fuel pipe instantly blasted open the internal small-cycle ignition system of the Empire's battleship from the inside, resulting in a series of continuous explosions. The violent and muffled sounds of explosions rang out one after another inside the battleship. Countless flames and heat waves spewed out, swallowing the Empire's soldiers. Rapid and short screams mixed in with the sound of explosions were abnormally clear. The back of the corridor also began to explode. The flames and heat waves spewed out under the effect of the pressure difference, chasing after the black MXT like a fire dragon, or rather, pushing it even faster. At this time, the tri-winged battleship had already swooped down at high speed to a place 300 kilometers away from the battleship. He was going to seek refuge in the Sea of Stars. The Sea of Stars was right in front of him. But it was far away on the horizon. Suddenly, just less than 100 meters away from the large hole in the outer wall of the battleship, the black MXT that was advancing at high speed suddenly twisted its body forcefully for some reason and slammed heavily into the left side of the corridor. The black mecha's seemingly unreasonable pause and dodge just so happened to avoid death. At that moment, the right side of the corridor seemed to have turned into a crispy caviar biscuit. Pieces of it peeled off and scattered, and a sharp light that could even be described as mournful slashed out from those pieces without any warning, slashing toward the black MXT's right shoulder. With a whoosh, a deep wound appeared on the outer armor of the black MXT's left shoulder. There was actually no way to completely dodge the opponent's casual attack that had not been brewing for a long time. Amidst the flying wall fragments, a light green mecha walked out like a demon god and coldly attacked the black MXT. Its momentum was before the Sea of Stars, and it was overwhelmingly powerful. Chapter 570. The tunnel used by the Empire's light-class battleship to eject space fighters was nearly 30 meters high and even wider. It looked like a flat tunnel filled with the smell of metal and machinery. A large hole had been blasted open in the door that separated the ejection tunnel from space. Stars twinkled in the dark background outside. The walls of the tunnel were shattered into thousands of pieces. That flash of light, whose shape could not be seen clearly due to the high speed, accurately struck the black MXT. The black mecha that was charging outwards at high speed was completely unable to avoid this attack that was so sharp and deadly. In the face of this sneak attack, the mecha's balance system was instantly disrupted. The heavy metal body flipped forward, and like a boulder that had been struck by lightning, the mecha tumbled forward. The mecha and the floor of the tunnel emitted an ear-piercing sound of friction, as well as the loud sound of metal clashing against each other. The out-of-control black MXT rolled forward at high speed in the tunnel, crashing here and there. It looked so pathetic in the howling wind. However, in the next moment, when the black mecha once again slammed into the wall of the tunnel, its right mechanical arm slammed into the ground like a spike. The heavy metal body suddenly paused, and like a restless rock that had hit a protruding rock, it once again bounced up restlessly. Before the black mecha could barely regain its balance, its trembling mechanical legs turned into a series of afterimages as it continued to charge forward. As the black MXT accelerated again, some auxiliary components flew out from its trembling body, and a terrible wound appeared on its right shoulder armor. It was like the red and white mouth of a baby that was turned over after a knife wound. It seemed to be smiling, but in fact, it was extremely chilling. In the dimly lit cockpit, Su Li's face was pale. The shock in his eyes instantly turned into a trace of ruthlessness. Without hesitation, he pushed the MXT into overclocking mode. His combat style had always been tough yet conservative. He would never reveal his trump card until the very last moment. Previously, when he had launched a surprise attack on the Empire's battleship command center, even at that moment, the MXT had not entered overclocking mode. However, at this moment, the black MXT entered overclocking mode for the first time. He did not choose to turn around and finish off the Empire mecha that had appeared out of nowhere. Instead, he chose to continue charging forward in an attempt to escape. This was because he could clearly feel the power of the Imperial mecha behind him. He knew that he was in a life-or-death situation. From the moment he was ambushed until now, he did not have the time to observe the Imperial mech behind him, but he could clearly feel an oppressive feeling that seemed to want to freeze all the whistling air in the tunnel. In Donglin, he had hammered his body with the uncle and turned his trembling into an impressive ability. In the capital ring, he had come into contact with mecha and learned how to use the simulation system to directly operate a mecha. Gradually, countless people in the Federation had gotten used to Su Li's powerful mecha operation skills. This was proven from the test run on Cocky Peak to the countless battles in the West Woods. Whether it was the special class pilots of the Federation or the ace pilots of the Imperial Expeditionary Force, it seemed like no one was qualified to be his opponent. Su Li himself also developed a kind of understanding that was not arrogance, but absolute confidence. Every time he sat in his personal mech and put on the simulation system, he could feel absolute calm and confidence, as if there was no one in this universe who could defeat him. Until now. Breaking through the wall, a cold and precise slash. The mysterious Imperial mech behind him had only made 2 simple movements, but it had brought him a terrifying pressure that he had never felt before. Because he had dodged that flash of light in a panic, only then did he know that 2 simple movements of the Imperial mech were able to hurt him when he was charging at high speed. What kind of high frequency and precise operation was required? There was also that steady but extraordinarily fierce battle aura, which actually covered the mysterious Imperial mech with a layer of the strong aura of an ancient king. Su Li's eyes were bright because of nervousness. For the first time in many years, he felt danger or even despair in a mech. The Imperial mech behind him made him feel a sense of fear. Even the crazy Mad Manly on Cocky Peak did not reach this level of fear. It was probably because when he was at the Old Moon base, Mad Manly did not really want to kill him. However, the pilot in this Imperial mech, who had control that was not inferior to Mad Manly, wanted him dead. In this sort of situation, Su Li's first choice was naturally to flee. Relying on the high-speed maneuverability of the MXT in overclocked state, he shook off the terrifying Imperial mecha behind him. A strong sense of foreboding rose in his heart. As soon as the opponent caught up to him, something very bad would happen. After killing the Butcher General and avenging the ancient Bell ship, he definitely did not want to go back and have a one-on-one battle with the Butcher General. That scene might be very romantic and heroic, but it was not what he wanted. He wanted to go home, go back to the universe of the Federation, and not become a beautiful firework on the battleship of a foreign country. Even if he had to die together with the enemy, he was not willing. The tri-winged battleship controlled by the old man should be rushing into the sea of stars outside the black hole soon, right? The Black MXT, under the Empire mecha's calm and even somewhat cold high-speed fire, evaded in an extremely awkward and thrilling manner. It moved between the smoke and metal flowers and was lucky not to be hit, but its speed was slowed down. Fuck. In the dimly lit cockpit, the face exposed outside the helmet twitched slightly. Under unprecedented pressure, Su Li let out a roar that sounded almost like a groan. He forced out all of the mysterious burning energy in his body and transmitted it to every part of the MXT's transmission system, forcing the mecha to increase its speed even though it was already close to its peak speed. When the fingertips of the mechanical arms that were as firm as rocks in the wind were about to touch the box on the ground, when they were about to fly out of the hole that was full of metal fragments, when they were about to jump into the sea of stars and seek freedom and return home, a cold light flashed again and cut off all their hopes. The light cut into the metal box coldly, cutting the satellite thruster inside into countless broken parts, clinking and clanging non-stop. In Su Li's ears, these crisp sounds were like his heart being frozen and then shattered into pieces. Outside the black hole, the familiar three-winged warship turned into a stream of light and passed by in a flash. The Imperial fleet nearby had already reacted, and a dense concentration of weapons shrouded the area. Presumably, the three-winged warship under the old man's sole control would not be able to find a chance to dive again. This was not the plan. This was not how the plot of the story was supposed to develop. Su Li's bright eyes returned to normal. He continued to operate the mecha at high speed, but his eyes slowly narrowed. Previously, when he broke into the warship, he had hidden the satellite thruster here. This was the only way out he had prepared. He had imagined being chased and intercepted by the Imperial soldiers inside the warship. He might not have the chance or time to install the thruster on the mecha, so in his imagination, there had been a very thrilling and exceptionally beautiful scene. The black MXT mecha grabbed the metal box and charged out of the warship at high speed. Under the dumbfounded gazes of the Imperial soldiers, it glided at high speed due to inertia. In the empty and quiet space, the mecha installed the thruster, and the jet propelled the mecha to connect with the three-winged warship several kilometers away at high speed. Then, it turned into a stream of light and elegantly escaped from the Empire, returning home through the space passage. However, all of this turned into bubbles because of that cold and elegant light. In the metal box that exploded on the ground to the right of the MXT mecha's leg, the light that had plunged Su Li into a desperate situation finally showed its true form because of that rare moment of silence. It was a weapon that had only appeared in movies. A gun. An unusually normal-looking alloy multi-layer forging gun. The gun was nearly 5 meters long, and its entire body glowed with a faint gray metallic luster. There was no sense of fatality, only a sense of death. However, what was very strange was that this lifeless giant alloy gun gave off the feeling that it was alive. It could spring up at any time and emit a fatal and cold light. This was because the end of the alloy gun was held in the mechanical arm of the mysterious Imperial mecha. With the thrusters destroyed, the few kilometers of space travel distance in the escape plan was as long as the current time for the MXT mecha in combat mode. Even if the tri-winged battleship rushed over to pick him up, the mecha would become the dust of history under the bombardment of the Imperial battleships if it floated in space for more than 5 seconds. The explosions and flames on the upper layer of the battleship were still ongoing, but the black MXT could no longer leave. Su Li knew that he had no other choice. In his slightly narrowed eyes, a feeling of despair appeared for the first time in his life. Despair meant that there was no hope, but it did not mean that he had given up, and it did not mean that he had surrendered. Su Li was best at finding a way out of a dead end, seeing hope in despair. Even if the final road ahead was still dark and gloomy, he still had to try and fight. Previously, he did not turn back because he wanted to leave alive. Now that it was impossible to leave alive, why not fight and not turn back? The alloy gun that had pierced deeply into the metal box, and even into the depths of the tunnel's hard ground, suddenly seemed like a stiff dragon that had awakened after 1,000 years of slumber. The tip of the gun rose and turned into a ray of mournful light, piercing straight into the cockpit of the black MXT. Boom! The alloy blade poked out of the black MXT's mechanical arm, and with a strange swipe, it happened to cut right on the tip of the alloy gun. The unpleasant sound of metal scraping against metal came to an abrupt stop. The beam of the gun retracted and retreated solemnly. After a moment of slight trembling, the blade was placed horizontally in front of the mech's chest. There was a temporary silence. For the first time, the two most powerful mecha of the Federation and the Empire faced each other head-on. No one made the first move, each silently standing in their respective positions. Su Li narrowed his eyes as he looked at the Empire mech that had forced him into such a desperate situation. He found that this mech had undergone some sort of modification that he could not understand for the time being. The various joints and transmission points did not have those ugly and sinister metal spikes, but were instead wrapped in small metal boxes. Because of these small metal boxes, this Empire mech's design appeared very strange. It was as if there were countless ugly trash boxes hanging on its body, and it seemed that with every step it took, these metal boxes would fall off, like the fallen fruits of a ripe peach tree, smashing into a deadly peach miasma. My mech is called Peach Miasma. Chapter 571. The peach blossoms blossomed one after another, blooming to the point that it was time for the flowers to break. The fragrant scent turned into miasma, intoxicating all living things and making it difficult for them to wake up again. If they did not wake up, only death awaited them. In the dim and stuffy cockpit, Sulu heard the two words peach miasma, and his mind instantly recalled an old passage of text he had read in the library of the State University years ago. This memory did not occupy him too much of his attention. He was more surprised that the other person actually had such a perfect Federation pronunciation, and that calm and profound indifference the other person displayed. The explosions above the tunnel were still ongoing. Every now and then, violent roars would ring out, causing the ground to tremble incessantly. Flames and gushing air currents came from the depths of the tunnel, heading towards outer space that was cold enough to devour all life. The warship could disintegrate and explode at any time, and the environment was abnormally harsh and dangerous. Yet, the Empire person inside this strangely shaped mech was still so calm and collected as he introduced himself, calmly waiting for the arrival of the battle, without a trace of urgency. Judging from the voice, this Empire mech master was not very old. The cool and indifferent tone even gave people the illusion that the other person was still in his adolescence. Sulu slowly took in deep breaths, mobilizing every bit of burning power in his body. He narrowed his eyes at the Empire mech on the screen, confirming that the other was probably a genius lunatic like Li Feng. Only this kind of person who pursued the realm of mecha battle fanatically would risk the danger of the warship exploding in order to seek a satisfying battle. From another perspective, only people who were extreme in certain aspects could reach such a terrifying level in mecha piloting. Mad Manly was like that, and the unknown Empire mech pilot opposite him was like that. Was he not like that himself? Lucio. Su Li's reply rang out from the crudely made external speaker of the slightly battered black MXD. On the snowfield of 5460, there was once an Empire ace pilot who challenged him. At that time, he silently killed the other party in an instant and refused to say a single word. This was because the difference in strength between the two parties was too great. It was an unequal battle, so why would he need to play those chivalrous tricks? This Imperial mecha opposite him had enough qualifications to make Sulu respected out of caution. Moreover, he also wanted to use this opportunity to adjust his still shaken mental state. Thus, he had temporarily come up with a name for his mecha. The two words Lucio naturally referred to him and Shang Qiu, the two most crucial figures in the Federation's research and development of the MX mecha. Hearing this name, the Imperial mecha, Peach Miasma, did not react at all. Perhaps the young officer inside had recalled some information and guessed Su Li's identity. The Peach Miasma mecha did not react. It did not move. Sulu narrowed his eyes even more. The other party was waiting for him to make the first move. They clearly knew how terrifying his MXT was, yet they still stood in the distance arrogantly and indifferently, unwilling to make the first move. What kind of pride and confidence did this represent? Other than that legendary princess, when had such a powerful figure appeared in the Empire? He took a deep breath, and the source of the scorching power behind his waist instantly spread throughout his entire body. He could clearly feel the power transmitted to every pair of muscle fibers, every pore, and every nail. Two unhealthy but exceptionally bright blushes appeared on his pale cheeks. The auxiliary valve used to connect to the satellite's propulsion device popped off from the black MXT's metal waistline with a click. Amidst the roaring airflow, it fell to the ground behind him. Boom! The black MXT burst forward. Under the boost of the full power of its dual engines, the huge body of the mecha instantly accelerated. It actually broke through the air in the tunnel with a terrifying sonic boom. Almost at the same time, the Imperial mecha called Peach Miasma also moved, charging over with a boom. This strange and even somewhat ugly mecha with metal boxes hanging all over its body started slightly later than the black MXT controlled by Su Lo. However, with the full power output of the micro-engines at the spherical joints, it actually completely closed the gap between the speed of the two mecha in an extremely short amount of time. The black MXT trembled violently, like a man in the prime of his life who had epilepsy. Its two heavy mechanical legs moved forward in a strange manner like lightning. Amidst the ghostly and elusive visual effects, it was full of valiant willpower. The Cyan Empire mecha seemed to be unable to withstand the current speed and also began to tremble. The metal boxes attached to the joints of the mecha let out a rapid and concentrated sound, like countless small war drums being beaten at the same time. The two most advanced mechas in the universe collided fiercely with no surprise. The air around the tall mecha was squeezed away at the same time, sweeping up the debris, turning into a mottled ball that suddenly swelled up. Then, the violent and dull sound of the collision rang out. Then, there was a series of incomparably sharp sounds of metal colliding. No one knew how many effective controls the Black MXT and the Cyan mecha had performed in this instant, and how many close-range dodges they had performed in small areas. The naked eye could not see the flowing light of the mechas in that mottled spherical space at all. Only these concentrated sounds of metal colliding reverberated in all directions, suppressing the whistling sound produced by the high-speed air leakage of the battleship. The support valve that the Black MXT had bounced off earlier finally fell to the ground at this time, rolling and hitting the tunnel wall before coming to a stop. The two mechas that were exchanging blows at a terrifying control rate also seemed to pause slightly at the same time. After a momentary pause, a piercing light flashed, as if to split apart this entanglement of danger. The source of the light was not the Cyan mecha, but the sharp alloy knife at the front of the Black MXT's right mechanical arm. This was the most dangerous moment. Inside the cockpit, Su Li's eyes suddenly lit up. His body hovering in the air, he controlled the Black MXT to perform the last of the 10 poses that the uncle had taught him, and also the most ruthless one. The Black MXT crashed madly into the Cyan mecha's arms, its mechanical leg suddenly springing up, the tip of its knee aiming straight for the Cyan mecha's lower abdomen. The movement was clean and efficient to the extreme, but also extremely valiant. It did not care about the follow-up movements at all, only wanting to live and die together. However, that sharp alloy knife, that similarly piercing light, retracted in an instant with an aura that was the complete opposite of madness. Silently, it stabbed out from under the mecha's elbow, sinisterly stabbing towards the Cyan mecha's cockpit amidst a sea of dazzling debris and strong winds. The Cyan mecha had not been able to determine the direction of this stab, and had not been able to guess the soft and sinister strike that the Black MXT would make after its sudden burst. No matter how strong the control of that Empire genius was, it was likely that there was no way he could avoid this suddenly dimmed but now even more dangerous light in such a small space. Therefore, the Cyan mecha did not retreat. Instead, its body shook violently, and it charged forward fiercely. In the shortest amount of time, its left mechanical arm blocked the front of that light, while its entire body performed an exquisite sliding step backwards, sweeping towards the right side of the Black MXT. Amidst the violent and frenzied attacks of the Black MXT, there was a sinister and silent fatal blow hidden within. The Cyan Empire mecha, on the other hand, performed a sliding step backwards that seemed to violate the laws of physics in its high-speed dash. At this moment, the two mecha displayed their most impressive side. Two completely opposite control techniques actually overlapped so perfectly at the same time. Other than the two people in the cockpit, who else could do such a thing? Unable to avoid that stab, the Cyan Empire mecha took a step forward, as if a storm was brewing beneath its feet. An irresistible monarch's aura gushed out. At the same time, it slid backwards in that instant, turning it into an awe-inspiring king's bow, indestructible. There was an arrow on the string, and the arrow was precisely that heavy alloy spear. Su Li's face did not show any signs of shock or fear. Like a child immersed in a cartoon, he stared at the cold light of the alloy spear on the screen, his body trembling uncontrollably. He did not allow the MXT to attempt any evasive maneuvers, but instead valiantly chose to continue attacking with his knife. He wanted to stake his life on the line. He wanted to bet on which of the two would pierce the other's cockpit first. He wanted to bet on the hardness values of the Federation and the Empire Mecha's protective boards. He wanted to bet on his own and the other's willpower. He wanted to bet on his luck in this moment of life and death. Right now, the scene was like two warships flying at relatively high speeds in a small warp tunnel. Whoever could not bear the smell of death and tried to avoid it first would lose the momentum and initiative in this battle of courage, or perhaps stupidity. For Su Li, he had no choice but to fight. Facing this majestic and inviolable Cyan Empire mecha, he had no confidence in a normal battle, not to mention that he was currently on the Empire's warship. Moreover, he already had no path of retreat and had walked into a dead end. If he did not fight now, when would he fight? The blade brushed past the upper edge of the Cyan mecha's left mechanical arm and stabbed down like a ghost in the wind. It easily pierced through the metal boxes attached to the joints of the other's mechanical arm and then continued forward, the sharp alloy knife ruthlessly piercing through the outer wall of the other's cockpit. Up until now, the Cyan mecha was still cold and silent. It did not make any evasive maneuvers, as if there was not the slightest bit of fear in the face of impending death. Perhaps the Empire officer inside the mecha did not even think of death as a threat at all. He believed that he was stronger than death itself. A strong sense of unease flashed through Su Li's heart. However, in this high-frequency battle on the microsecond scale, once one decided to go all out for the kill, there was no room for retreat. The black MXT trembled violently. The alloy knife at the front of the right mechanical arm broke through another 2 layers of the Empire mecha's cockpit's superhard alloy protective boards and finally made contact with the other's inner wall. In less than the blink of an eye, it would be able to pierce through and kill that unknown Empire elite. However, right at this moment, the metal box that had been pierced first, exploded. The explosion was not very powerful, but the precise angle of the bullet's explosion and the self-destructing armor made the black MXT's alloy knife pause abruptly. Like a mechanical device without electricity, it sizzled for a moment and then came to an abrupt stop, turning into a lifeless statue. The final half a meter of distance between victory and defeat turned out to be so far away. The alloy multi-layer forging spear pierced deeply into the black MXT's cockpit. Sparks flashed from time to time from the hole that had been cracked by the powerful force. The Cyan Empire mecha held the other end of the spear and looked down at the kneeling black MXT from above. It was as cold and proud as a monarch. The spear was slowly pulled out of the black MXT's cockpit. The original metallic gray was slightly blackened by the mecha, and there were also a few large patches of shocking bright red on it. It was like a spring peach painting scroll drawn with ink and cinnabar. Chapter 572. The metal spear shrank and shortened with a crack, and a few drops of dye-like liquid fell from the impact. The outer armor of the green peach miasma mecha opened from the middle, and the spear was stored inside like a sword sheath. The soul-devouring chill gradually disappeared. In front of the warship's passage, there was a heavy sound of metal rails rubbing against each other. The automatic repair device outside the warship ran over through the thick slide rail. Countless welding points began to burn in the thin air, glowing and heating. Finally, the temporary repair of the hole was completed, and the howling hurricane in the passage was much softer. However, there was no way to effectively control the fire and explosion on the upper deck of the warship. The soldiers of the Empire ran into the passageway and looked at the fallen Black Federation mecha on the ground and the standing green mecha with complicated expressions. They guessed in shock what had just happened and who was inside the green mecha. Prepare to evacuate. An indifferent and calm voice came from the green mecha, but it did not allow anyone to question or object. Then, with the humming sound of hydraulic pressure, the cockpit of the mecha that had a large hole in it slowly opened. Dim light spilled in and shone on someone's body. It was an ordinary face. The lines weren't deep, but they were clear. It made his facial features look a little cold, especially the calm pride that came from his bones. For some reason, it made people feel that the word valiant came from his handwriting. Huai Chaoshi undid the black data band on his body and stood on the heavy and thick metal door of the cockpit. His thin body did not tremble in the cold air of the tunnel. He looked at the troublesome Federation mecha a few meters away from him and listened to the automatic alarm of the warship system. He could not help but slowly narrow his eyes. The Empire killed that tiger and destroyed the ancient bell. The Federation officer in this mecha killed Duke Carton and was going to destroy this flagship. This revenge was really equal, he thought in his heart. The soldiers below the mecha were operating the heavy suspension tools, trying to open the cockpit of the MXT mecha. Although they were nervous and did not know how His Majesty and the military would deal with them after Duke Carton's tragic death, as soldiers, they knew very well how important this new Federation mecha was to the Empire. They had to take this mecha away with them as much as possible before they evacuated. After a few shouts, the cockpit of the MXT mecha was finally successfully opened. The Empire's soldiers angrily dragged Su Lo out of the cockpit and threw him to the ground like trash. At the same time, the engineers began to connect the data to prevent the Federation mecha from self-destructing. He didn't die. Huai Chaoshi looked down at the ground and thought in surprise. The waist of the young Federation officer on the ground was a mess of flesh and blood. His short black hair was tangled together by sweat and was messily resting beside his pale face. There was no trace of trembling under his closed eyelids. He was probably in a deep coma. Despite having his cockpit pierced by an alloy spear, the other party was still alive. Kai Chaoshi did not know how this Federation officer had managed to do this at the last moment, and a faint sense of vigilance grew in her heart. He jumped down from the Peach Miasma mecha and walked towards the unconscious Su Lo. The sound of his leather military boots was unusually clear and loud. It was jarring even in the noisy tunnel. Looking down at Su Lo with his hands behind his back, Huai Chaoshi's narrowed eyes gradually relaxed. There was no trace of a smile on his face. Instead, there was some kind of consideration. Right at this moment, the fingers on Su Li's right hand trembled slightly. It seemed to be an involuntary reaction from the nerves in his coma. A series of low explosions sounded in the cockpit of the black MXT mecha. The engine roared, and smoke and dust flew everywhere. The Federation soldiers who were in the midst of data connection and deciphering inside the mecha were affected by this explosion. They screamed as they were shaken out of the cockpit and set on fire. A cold light flashed through Huai Chaoshi's eyes. He subconsciously turned his head to look. The unconscious and seriously injured Su Lo suddenly opened his eyes at this time. His body that was originally as weak as a garbage bag suddenly trembled violently and bounced up. His legs crossed in front of him like lightning, and his fists were like iron hammers that broke through the wind and blasted out. He did not know the identity of this young Federation soldier in front of him. Although he looked like he was wearing a normal soldier's uniform, to be able to possess such terrifying mecha piloting skills and such a mentality, the other was definitely not a normal character. Heavily injured and on the brink of death, if he wanted to live, the only way was to take this Federation soldier as a hostage. This was his last chance. His heavily injured and exhausted body could only support him for one last attempt. The wind from his fists was like a hammer, his body like iron, his footsteps like the wind. Su Lo placed all of his hopes for survival on this one blow. The mysterious burning power he had cultivated for many years gushed out. Using the powerful close combat techniques he had practiced since childhood, he held nothing back as he blasted it all out. This young Federation soldier in front of him was definitely a genius in mecha piloting. He was even stronger than Su Lu in Mad Manly, but, when it came to close combat attacks, who could be his match? A ray of light suddenly appeared in the midst of despair, the wind from his fists howled. The air vibrated, and the afterimages trembled. It was unstoppable. Huai Chaoshi turned his head and saw this scene from the corner of his eye. His pupils contracted abruptly, and then, that normal and indifferent face actually did not show the slightest trace of panic or fear. There was only calmness and a completely aroused desire to fight. Bang 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 bang. A series of dense explosive sounds exploded between the two people's bodies. It was just like how the two mecha had attacked each other without any regard for their own lives the moment they met. The wind from his fists and the shadows of his legs flashed. Simple, direct, and powerful close combat joint techniques were thrown out. Who knew how many punches landed on the other's blocking arms, and how many vicious finger thrusts landed on the other's body? Huai Chaoshi's body suddenly froze. He took 3 steps back before stabilizing himself. A trickle of blood seeped out from the corner of his lips, but he stubbornly refused to fall. Before he retreated, his foot wearing a hard military boot stomped down viciously on Su Li's lower abdomen. This kick was fast and swift. It was simple to the extreme, but also terrifying to the extreme. It was like a reef in the middle of the waves. There was not much of a stance. Just by being hard and steady, it could break through the white foam and salty water for billions of years. Su Li's body was kicked viciously to the ground. His already injured waist and abdomen were bleeding profusely. His abdomen felt like it was being torn apart, and he no longer had any ability to fight. His legs were limp and paralyzed. He leaned against the metal wall of the passageway, breathing heavily. He stared at the young Empire soldier in front of him, his eyes full of shock. Defeated, and thoroughly defeated. He was not a match for this Empire youth in mecha piloting. Even in close combat, he had actually lost to the other. Who exactly was this Empire soldier in front of him? How could such a skinny body contain such a huge amount of energy? He vaguely thought of a possibility, but he did not dare to believe it. Su Li's face was deathly pale. He knew that he would never be able to return to the Federation alive. He stared at the Empire soldier in front of him with complicated emotions. He wanted to say something, but instead he spat out a mouthful of blood, which splattered all over his body and onto the ground. Huai Chaoshi walked over with an expressionless face. She raised her right foot and kicked him heavily in the chest. Only the sound of bones cracking could be heard and a sentence filled with endless resentment and anger could be heard. Chapter 573. The morning sun shone on the training grounds of the Federation's 1st Military Region's Special Mecha Team. The dense foliage fanned out the light and separated the temperature, making the feeling of late spring and early summer blur together. The military camp, which was usually tense and serious, seemed to be more relaxed and lively because of this rare long holiday. There were no more emergency orders in the middle of the night, and the seemingly never-ending actual combat exercises finally came to an end for the time being. There was a small pond beside the Special Mecha Team's camp. Nominally, it was under the jurisdiction of HTD Bureau, but in reality, it had long become a small lake in the backyard of the soldiers. The young men full of testosterone had launched fierce attacks on the amphibians in the pond out of curiosity, but in the end, they found that their stomachs didn't seem to like those thin green legs that looked like level 2 hard synthetic meat. There was a young man wearing a well-ironed military uniform beside the pond. Under the tight military uniform hid a burly and explosive body. There was a hint of arrogance and ruthlessness in his cold eyes. Only the warm and clear morning sun shone directly on his face, could illuminate the last trace of youthfulness on this face. Li Feng came from Philadelphia. He was one of the top elites of the federal military. Even if Su Lu came out of nowhere, he couldn't steal his glory. He was about to step into the most beautiful years of his 20s. It was a good time for the lush green leaves to bloom in the spring breeze. However, for some reason, he had been feeling inexplicably restless these past few days, but he couldn't find the source of this restlessness. Thus, after waking up in the wee hours of the morning and completing his routine electric current stimulation, he came to this small pond to silently think. He left home at a young age and completed his puberty amidst the flames of war in the West Woods. Growing up was so exciting that it was even a little deformed, so he rarely came home to Philadelphia. However, perhaps because of his bloodline and respect, he always subconsciously learned or imitated that great-grandfather of his. The wristwatch on his left wrist tightened slightly and vibrated clearly. Li Feng looked down and saw that it was an emergency order. Although his face was still expressionless, his strong heart couldn't help but twitch slightly. He abruptly stood up and walked towards the barracks. Under the banyan tree by the pond, 2 officers flashed out and caught up with his quick footsteps. At the same time, under his gaze, they began to quickly make phone calls, hoping to be the first to know what this emergency assembly meant before the Department of Defense's order was clear. A few years ago, Li Feng had caused havoc in Parliament Hill and turned Senator Zion's office into a garbage dump. To prevent such a vicious incident from happening again, Philadelphia and the Department of Defense had jointly sent trusted officers to guard him. It was just that they had been together for too long. While these officers were carrying out military orders, they naturally became his direct subordinates. Something big must have happened, but I don't have enough authority, so I can't find out. An officer moved the phone away from his ear and looked at Li Feng's thick back and said uneasily. Li Feng's footsteps suddenly stopped. He turned around and took the phone. After dialing a number, he waited for a moment and said softly, "Yuzi, it's me. Today's emergency assembly has been confirmed. This is a joint mission of all 4 military regions. The security level has also been raised. I want to know why." With his family background, there was no secret that the federal military could hide from him. However, the Philadelphia family would not allow him to use this privilege. Fortunately, although he was not old, he had a few trustworthy and capable friends of the same age in the Federation. However, what made him feel shocked and strongly uneasy was that Zhou Yu, after trying for a long time, could only apologetically say that there was no way to find out the specifics. She only knew that something big must have happened in the Federation. Li Feng stood in the shadow under the banyan tree silently for a moment, completely ignoring the increasingly urgent emergency assembly call in the barracks ahead. Suddenly, he picked up the phone and pressed a string of familiar numbers that he couldn't be more familiar with. The call didn't go through. It wasn't busy, it wasn't transferred to the General Staff Department, it wasn't out of service, it was just that there was no response, no response. He dialed again, but the call still didn't go through. Li Feng raised his head and looked at the clear light between the leaves. Suddenly, a hint of viciousness flashed across his face. He pressed the number again, so viciousness that it seemed to want to break the sturdy military phone. The call went through, and a beautiful female voice came through. "Hello, this is the General Staff Department Transfer Center of the West Woods Military Region. According to the relevant regulations, please register your name." The viciousness between Li Feng's brows suddenly dimmed. His eyes widened in disbelief as he slowly hung up the phone. The other end of the call was the most standard transfer procedure, but he knew that ever since he was 12 years old, as long as he made a call, the person on the other end of the call would definitely pick up immediately. A military vehicle roared as it left the Special Mecha Brigade's camp. The soldiers who were in the midst of an emergency assembly looked at the smoke and dust on the road in shock. They didn't know what was wrong with the young prodigy in the vehicle, actually daring to defy military orders and leave. In the passenger seat of the dark green military vehicle, Li Feng buried his head in his strong body, as if he didn't want to hear what the officer in the back seat said. The news received from Philadelphia is that the 3 major fleets have already set off, and the fastest light fleet is currently heading towards the Night Scorpion Nebula. Their target is the location of the ancient bell. The officer put down the phone and reported in shock and difficulty, the ancient bell was ambushed by the Empire's fleet, no one survived. Li Feng's shoulders suddenly stiffened, but he didn't make any sound. He just moved up and down slightly with the movement of the military vehicle. Suddenly, without any warning, the usually arrogant and violent head that was hanging low in his body let out a series of painful howls, just like an injured beast. Madman Li had been fighting in the front lines of the West Woods since he was 12 years old. He always had a goal in front of him, and it wasn't as unreachable as his grandfather by the lake. Instead, it was so real and close. During his youth, he grew up under the care of that person. In a sense, that person partially replaced the role of his father in his life. No one knew how close his relationship with the West Woods tiger was. Even the Philadelphia family didn't know, and no one could imagine how he would feel when he heard the bad news. The officer in the vehicle was pale. They were Li Feng's most loyal partners and subordinates. They only knew a little about the situation, but they didn't expect him to have such a big reaction. "Where are we going at this time?" "To the spaceport. I want to go back to the West Woods." Maybe it was because he buried his head in his arms, or maybe it was because of something else. Li Feng's voice sounded a little dull and weak at the moment. "This is disobeying a military order, and, if Director Li knows, he will definitely not agree." One of the officers suppressed the nervousness in his heart and refuted. Li Feng raised his head and glanced at the officer in the vehicle. His voice was flat as he said, I want to go back to the West Woods." He didn't cry when he heard the news of Commander Zhong's death, but at the moment, his eyes were red and full of terrifying veins that were triggered by his violent emotions. Facing such a pair of eyes in such a calm and terrifying tone, no one dared to raise any objections. Even if these officers could guess that once Li Feng returned to the West Woods, he would definitely do something earth-shattering. At this moment, the phone rang again. General Li Jiedu said calmly, "What do you want to do?" "I want to kill someone." Li Feng heard his father's voice, and a trace of stubbornness flashed across his handsome face. He said, "No one can fucking stop me." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the phone. Li Jiedu didn't expect that the news of Zhong Shouhu's death would actually make his son so angry and agitated. After a moment, he said, "Su Lo has already gone over. Give me the authority." Li Feng paused for a moment and said, "I want to see him do it." In the command hall on the outskirts of the capital special district, there was a commotion. Countless senior technicians were decrypting and restoring a section of the signal from a distant star region. The senior staff of the Department of National Defense, with the help of computers, were frowning and thinking hard about many complicated things. Who gave him the authority to use the charter network that the Federation buried in advance? A gloomy and angry roar sounded in the hall. The director of the Military Committee of the Federation Parliament looked at the data feedback on the giant screen excitedly and waved his arms vigorously. "This is related to the foundation of the Federation's attack on the Empire. Make him stop immediately." The National Security Advisor's expression was also ugly. He said gloomily into the microphone, "Three-winged battleship, I order you to stop immediately and withdraw immediately. Otherwise..." Bang! A porcelain vase that was thrown into the hall interrupted the anger of these big shots. The crisp sound of the vase shattering shocked everyone. The entire command hall was silent for a moment. Li Feng didn't know what he threw at the vase. He walked over with a gloomy face. The military police in the command hall immediately surrounded him. At this time, sitting on the second floor, the president waved his hand with a gloomy expression. The military police had to disperse and let this ruthless lieutenant colonel walk directly to the control panel. At this time, dozens of hours had passed since the attack on the ancient bell. In the Federation society, which appeared to be peaceful on the surface, it was just a few days of changing between day and night. However, for the people who heard this shocking news, it was extremely torturous. The Bureau of Proclamation's tri-winged battleship followed the Empire's fleet into the enemy's star sector in a decisive and reckless manner. The signal passed through the giant warp hole, and there was no fixed signal to amplify it, so it was somewhat unstable. The people in the command hall could only see blurry and intermittent images and the whimsical plan that they had just received. Li Feng stood in front of the control panel and slowly lowered his body to the microphone. He squeezed out a sentence from his solid chest, "Su Lu, help me kill him. If you can't do it this time, I will do it next time." A few minutes later, the entire command hall heard Su Li's reply from the tri-winged battleship, "I will kill him." Then the communication was cut off. 7 hours later, a civilian smuggling spaceship from the West Woods sent back the latest news to S1. This smuggling spaceship was monitoring the military channel a few days ago and learned that the ancient bell was attacked. As criminals who should not be exposed to the public, the people on the smuggling spaceship bravely made the decision to rescue Commander Zhong. However, when they arrived, they only saw the wreckage on the ground and a rescue capsule that flew back according to the predetermined procedure. Other than that, there was nothing. Chapter 574. The last image that the people of the Federation saw was shot by the Bureau of Proclamation's tri-wing warship. In the last image, the Empire's flagship exploded violently and turned into a dazzling firework in the quiet space. Then, even the tri-wing warship disappeared into the vast universe. The confirmation of the culprit of the attack on the ancient bell, the famous butcher general of the Empire, made many people in the upper class of the Federation excited. However, there was no news of Su Lu, which reduced the joy of revenge to the lowest point. That night, the Federation news channel authorized by the government turned into a black and white monochrome broadcast. All advertisements and entertainment programs were stopped. The news anchor reported the news of the attack on the ancient bell to hundreds of millions of Federation citizens with a sad and angry voice. At the same time, he claimed that the special forces sent by the federal military had successfully destroyed the shameless Empire's fleet. In the middle of the repeated news, it was the life of Zhong Suohu, the commander of the West Woods military region. The Federation government spared no effort to publicize the great achievements of this tiger in the front line for more than 10 years. The prosperous and safe Upper Woods region was shocked, and the remote and lonely East Woods region was shocked. The entire Federation society was shrouded in a gloomy fog. If the Federation government had not announced the successful revenge, this gloomy mood might have directly aroused the uneasiness of society. As for the West Woods region, which guarded the border of the Federation like stubborn orphans, had already fallen into hysterical anger and sadness. 3 moons climbed up, shining on the wild vegetables in Little Sister's basket. 3 moons fell, eating up the wild vegetables made by Little Sister. 3 moons disappeared, Little Sister also disappeared. 3 moons rose, Little Sister, when will you come back? Just like the helplessness and anger of this ballad that was created decades ago, and just like how Zhong Suohu lamented to Su Lu in the restaurant, the people of the West Woods uneasily and sorrowfully thought that they were just orphans of the Federation, wandering in the universe, singing sad songs in the west wind. No one would care about the life and death of the people of the West Woods. Fortunately, they had the Zhong family. For the past 10 years, they had that insufferably arrogant tiger. But now, that ferocious and friendly tiger had died without warning. In an instant, the people of the West Woods could not accept the fact that they had lost their hero, their leader. When they finally confirmed that this sad fact could not be changed, countless Westwoods soldiers swarmed to the periphery of the old house in Wait 2 district. They hugged their weapons and sat on the ground, forming a long line along several roads. No one organized them. They just subconsciously wanted to protect the commander's home and prevent any outsiders from coming. More people of the Westwoods began to cry and criticize the corruption of the Federation government and the incompetence of the federal fleet. Thinking of the Westwoods sweating and bleeding by the Federation, and the abruptness of the whole incident, countless conspiracy theories began to circulate in private. Just as the cosmic war between the Federation and the Empire was about to begin, social unrest in the Westwoods at the front line would lead to extremely serious consequences. What worried the Federation government even more was that no one knew whether the Westwoods soldiers and civilians who were loyal to the Zhong family would have more direct and strong political demands because of this incident. The Federation had to stabilize the situation in the Westwoods as soon as possible, and in the current tense situation, there were not many people who had enough influence to appease the people of the Westwoods and show the Federation's sincerity to the soldiers and civilians of the Westwoods. After thinking for a few hours, the old man by Lake Feiqing politely declined the request of the president's residents to go to the Westwoods to stabilize the situation. In the early morning, the Federation news channel broadcasted an urgent news. The president of the Federation would immediately set off for the Westwoods to preside over the grand funeral of Commander Zhong, his wife, and the soldiers of the Antique Bell. The people were in a frenzy, and the people's hearts were uncertain. Every combat unit in Ceylon's military was in a dangerous situation where they were absolutely on guard and had no clue what to do. President Pavel's decision to head to Ceylon to appease the people had, without a doubt, demonstrated his courage and determination that was different from normal politicians. And before the president went to the Westwoods, there was a more important matter to deal with. 3:30 in the morning, in the underground combat command room of the president's residence. The fact that the Empire's fleet could find the gap in the charter network and use our top-secret electronic imprint to cover it shows a lot of problems. The Department of Defense has newly coded all the electronic code systems 3 days ago, but if those problems can't be solved fundamentally, these technical means will become meaningless. President Pabre's voice was still strong, but his dark face looked a little thin and tired. Although the last conversation between them before Zhong Suehu left the capital did not achieve a satisfactory result, the president was still willing to see Commander Zhong as a kindred spirit. A potential political ally was buried in a space fireworks that no one expected. This blow and the situation in the Westwoods that followed made the president feel a lot of pressure. Fortunately, at this time, he did not have to worry that some families or spokespersons in the Federation would dare to question his decision to attack the Empire. I don't know if Lieutenant Colonel Su Lo has any evidence for what he said, and I don't want to investigate the source of his information. His outstanding performance on the battlefield, as well as his brave actions in chasing after the Empire's fleet, can completely prove his loyalty and love for the Federation. President Pabre's eyes swept over everyone in the room like a hawk, from the National Security Advisor, the Minister of Defense, the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, important cabinet ministers, specially invited representatives of the Parliament. He said in a deep voice, he said that there is still a seed of the Empire that is still in the Federation, so I ask you to find it. According to Lieutenant Colonel Su Li's information, the Federation Investigation Bureau entered the military prison as soon as possible, but did not find the target. The director of the Federation Investigation Bureau in a pure black suit looked at him and said seriously, but according to the preliminary investigation, we did find some problems. As for where that seed of suspicion is now, we need the help of the Bureau of Proclamation. Since the Bureau of Proclamation has been observing the seed, they should know where it is now. The target of this sentence was very clear. The eyes of the big shots in the Federation in the room all fell on a chair at the round table. The assistant director of the Bureau of Proclamation, Cui Zedong, was temporarily relieved of all authority 3 days ago. 3 special agents of the Special Task Force stood behind him at this time. Facing the suspicious and angry gazes of his colleagues, he said slowly with difficulty, "I have already explained that the Bureau of Proclamation suspended the investigation of that seat of suspicion because I directly received an email from the Office of the Minister of Defense, saying that the suspect is involved in a special military mission and needs to be temporarily quarantined." Minister of Defense Zhou Yingxing, who had been silent all this time, said, "I did not send such an email. For the sake of maximum safety, after the Medellin project, the President has already rejected the related anti-discord plan. Director Zhedong has just confirmed that the seed has disappeared or died, but I can't be at ease, so Assistant Chui, I think you need to be quarantined for a long time. As for the Office of the Minister of Defense, it must also be investigated." Zhou Yingxing nodded slightly, not deliberately hiding the heavy expression between his eyebrows. "In 2 hours, I will be going to the West Woods. I hope that the relevant investigation can come to a clear conclusion before the charter I arrives at Sunset State." President Pobre looked at the crowd sternly and said, "Everyone here is a pillar of the Federation. If there is a problem with any of us, it will be a big problem for the Federation. This matter involves the Bureau of Proclamation and the Ministry of Defense. The Federation Investigation Bureau does not have the ability to complete the investigation, so I have decided that the military combat forces will conduct the investigation. The investigation team will report directly to me, and I will leave the details to Mr. Byron. Vice President Byron has the authority to investigate the internal work of the Bureau of Proclamation, but according to the first charter, any powerful government agency, especially the military, is prohibited from actively interfering with the affairs of the Bureau of Proclamation." Chui Judong's expression changed. He did not care about his current situation and raised his objection loudly. "The military investigation team will not interfere with the affairs of the Bureau of Proclamation. They are investigating you." President Pobre looked at him coldly and said without any trace of politeness. Chui Judong's expression changed drastically. He tried to get the president to retract the order, but even when he was escorted out of the conference room by 3 special task force agents, he still turned around and struggled to express his objection. "Lieutenant General Du Shaoqing will be in charge of this investigation." President Pobre looked at the crowd and said in a heavy tone, "The death of Commander Zhong has proven the crazy aggressive instinct of the Empire. When it comes to the survival of the Federation, no department can stay out of it, not even the Bureau of Proclamation." The big shots in the conference room turned their eyes collectively again and looked at a shadowy corner outside the round table. Du Shaoqing, who had been sitting silently in the corner, slowly stood up. His straight military posture was impeccable. He gave the president a standard military salute and said in a deep voice, "I will not disappoint you." In the eyes of many people, Du Shaoqing, who had accumulated military merits to the rank of lieutenant general, would not be able to sit in the position of commander of the Iron 7th Division for too long. Although people were still used to calling him Commander Shaoqing in a respectful tone, the military talent he had displayed at the front line of the West Woods did indeed need a bigger stage. No one would have thought that his latest big stage would be the investigation team of the Federation appointed by the president himself. And the investigation was the mystery of the death of his lifelong enemy. Under his command, the fully armed soldiers divided and surrounded the Bureau of Proclamation and the Ministry of Defense as if they were in a battle. They cleanly invited the suspects of the Bureau of Proclamation and the Ministry of Defense back to the military camp from their homes. Ignoring the fierce resistance of the lawyers, they used all means to extend the detention period as much as possible and gradually deepened the investigation. Du Shaoqing, on the other hand, was silent in front of his desk. There was an old photo frame on the desk, and in front of the desk was a violin case. The long case was not opened, and no clear sound came out. Chapter 575. In the outskirts of the capital city of southern Galilee on planet S2, there was a heavily guarded Special Level 3 class of military prison. 2 days ago, hundreds of serious-looking members of the Federation Investigation Bureau were stationed here with the authorization documents of the Ministry of Defense. The black suits that were flashing at the checkpoints of countless rooms replaced the dark green military uniforms, which made the people in the prison feel extremely depressed. 3 days before the Federation Investigation Bureau took over this military prison, a prisoner mysteriously disappeared. No one knew how this prisoner left the Special Level 3 class of military prison. Even the Bureau of Proclamation lost the specific location of this person's identity chip, but there was no feedback that the information node disappeared. The investigation team appointed by President Pabre followed the footsteps of the Federation Investigation Bureau to this prison. The Internal Affairs Officer of the Iron 7th Division from the 2nd Military Region increased the intensity of the investigation of the prison under the cold command of President Du Shaoqing. The prisoners in the prison were all gathered in the side area. The cells that they used to live in became the prison's hell. From time to time, angry roars, curses, and screams could be heard from the 3rd floor of the prison. As many as 700 government employees and officers turned this prison into a surprisingly large interrogation room. They used all kinds of legal methods, but they still couldn't find any clues. The Federation's investigation of the attack on the ancient Bell ship and its efforts to find the hidden seed fell into a helpless halt. At this moment, countless pairs of anxious and angry eyes didn't notice a small forest 13 kilometers to the right of the prison. Under the simple building of the forest, there was a hidden underground fortification. At the end of the fortification, there was a dark room without any light or electronic equipment. The dim light of the primitive incandescent lamp shone on the rough stone walls of the room. The light gradually gathered to the side of the bed in the corner of the room, revealing a thin, pale, and desperate face. He had a very common name, He Yu. He was 36 years old this year. He entered the 2nd Military Academy at the age of 17. After graduation, he had been working in the Military Intelligence Department. Although the information he came in contact with was top secret and somewhat mysterious to the general public, this kind of work would become ordinary and boring after a long time. However, He Yu was not dissatisfied. He liked the breakfast sold outside the electronic code station building. He was used to the smell of disinfectant and light curtain glue in the building. Not to mention, when he was 30 years old, he fell in love with a waitress in the logistics department of the building. He had a gentle and kind wife, a daughter who was just 4 years old but still waited for him with a sweet smile and slippers every day. He had an ordinary but stable, and indeed meaningful job. He Yu was satisfied enough with this life. He Yu had always thought so, until one day more than a year ago, when he was driving home, he was suddenly stopped by a group of soldiers and arrested. Then, he learned the truth that was like a thunderclap. He Yu was a seed that was planted in the Federation. He Yu was from the Empire. No, this is such a ridiculous prank. I was born in the S2 industrial base, and my parents only gave birth to me when they were in their 40s. I have countless childhood friends and teachers who know of my existence, and you actually say that I'm from the Empire. Adoption certificate. No, I don't believe it. Biological markers. That's fake. What are you trying to do? I'm just a very ordinary officer. I don't have anything you want on me. Why must you accuse me of being from the Empire? More than a year ago, when He Yu heard this ridiculous accusation, his first reaction was this. That absurd feeling of astonishment turned into hysteria. This made him, who was considered to be extremely cowardly in the military academy, actually dare to ignore the gun barrels in the hands of those wardens. He angrily swung his fist and smashed it towards the brown-haired officer's face across the wide interrogation table. However, he did not hit the other party. Instead, he was smashed to the ground by the cold butt of the gun. After waking up from his coma, facing the detailed records of the Bureau of Proclamation and the ironclad evidence, Yu finally admitted to a certain fact in despair and frustration. Many years ago, the Empire took the risk of using a small spaceship to forcefully cross the space channel and transport a few batches of babies into Bermuda. Then, through the notorious human traffickers of Bermuda, they were sold to the Federation. They were sold to parents who did not have children but longed for them. These innocent and childish babies, who were even sleeping with their eyes closed, passed the examination of the charter and received a legal adoption certificate. An identity chip was implanted behind their necks. Without them knowing, they turned from being from the Empire to citizens of the Federation. And he was one of these babies that I was originally from the Empire. Then, when I cheered for every victory of the Federal Army on the front lines of the West Woods, was I actually celebrating the death of my own people? My life was all fake. An ordinary name, an ordinary job, a stable and happy life. They were all fake. Then, what was real? Yu, who could not accept this fact, became an ice sculpture that could not think. In just 3 days, his face became so thin that his bones could be seen. He knew that the Federation would not allow an Empire spy like him to live. Although before this, he did not know that he was arranged by the Empire to be a spy from the moment he was born. In a situation where he did not know and had no choice, he became a natural spy. He did not do anything bad, but he had to pay the price for a life that he did not know. What a sad and absurd life this was. However, the subsequent development of the matter was completely out of his expectations. If this was a nightmare, Yu would never have thought that after waking up from the nightmare, he would not have sunk into it. Instead, he would have started to have another bizarre dream. Those officers with mysterious identities did not send him to the secret court for trial and then lock him up for life. They also did not execute the military regulations and execute a secret execution. Instead, they directly released him. However, before he was released, the brown-haired officer's gentle but cold warning was like a basin of ice water that woke him up from his helpless state. The sound of footsteps outside the room made Yu jump in fright. Thinking back to his experiences over the past year, only then did he understand that the bizarre dream was still just a nightmare. Just like the disgusting curly brown hair of the officer who pushed open the door and entered. It is extremely difficult to find a place within the Federation that can completely block the light of the charter. The Federation officer walked into the room. After sitting on the chair, he removed the military cap from his head and carefully placed it beside his hand. He then rubbed his head full of curly brown hair and said with a calm voice, "With our abilities, even in this primitive underground cave, we can only block it for a few days. You've wasted a lot of time. I was forced to take the risk to come this time. This makes me feel extremely bad." Yu raised his head and looked at him with a somewhat deranged gaze. His voice was hoarse as he said, "You bunch of lunatics, murderers, so you also know fear. Are you worried that the Bureau of Proclamation will find out that you have met me before? A little, but not a lot. In the end, the glory of the charter is controlled by humans. Even if the Bureau of Proclamation can find me, without direct evidence, they can't bring up any charges against me. They can't even begin to suspect me. Just like this isolated room 60 meters underground. Apart from the chips behind our necks, there are no other components that can send out electronic information. We pay more attention to the spirit and procedures of the Federation than anyone else. The glory of the Charter has protected the Federation for tens of thousands of years. Presumably, it will also condone the actions of us, the subjects of the Federation." Yu looked at him with a numb expression and said, "You can directly kill me. Details determine success or failure," the brown-haired officer said. The brown-haired officer said, "Due to some unexpected circumstances, this investigation is being conducted. This investigation may endanger our cause, so I need your final cooperation to end this investigation." These somewhat heavy stories need the death of you, the last seed of the empire, to put a full stop to this. I'm not some bullshit seed. He shouted angrily at the other party, his facial features somewhat distorted in agitation. More than a year ago, we've already discussed this issue many times. I don't want to continue this discussion, the brown-haired officer said coldly. There was a long silence in the gloomy room, and then the sound of water dripping clearly rang out. He lowered his head in pain and hugged his body as if he was afraid of the cold. In this period of more than a year, he had obtained a lot of secret information from the hands of these mysterious soldiers. Moreover, under their arrangements, he had entered Bermuda and made contact with the people of the Imperial Royal Intelligence Agency. He had done many things that he could never have imagined before. He had originally thought that the federal military had allowed him to live because they wanted to use his identity as a seed of the empire to pass on false information to the empire and sow discord. Who could have known that the truth was actually more cruel than he had imagined? I agreed to pass on information to the empire because I convinced myself that I shouldn't care about betraying the empire's interests. I shouldn't care about the lives of those bullshit compatriots because I don't think I'm a person of the empire at all. When I was still a baby, I was heartlessly abandoned here by them. Why should I fight for them? He raised his head and allowed the tears to flow freely on his pained expression. He roared angrily, no. In reality, it was only because I wanted to let myself believe that I was still a citizen of the Federation, a soldier of the Federation, and that I was fighting for the interests of the Federation. My family, my friends, my colleagues, the first woman I fell in love with, the history I was most interested in, the stars I liked the most, the scenic spots I liked to visit the most, all of them belonged to the Federation. I am a person from the inside out. I belong to the Federation. My life has been spent here. I have a family, I have a wife, I have children. He said with a sorrowful voice, except for this body, this flesh and blood. But the information I passed on to the Empire had nothing to do with sowing discord at all. Instead, it led to the death of Commander Zhong. He hugged his head with both hands and looked at the brown-haired officer in disbelief and pain as he yelled, "What did you do? What did you want to do? Who is the traitor? Who is the seed of the Empire?" Hiyuyu's eyes wandered as he subconsciously muttered, "I am not, you are. You and those shameless big shots behind you are the seeds of evil." Chapter 578. Evil. What is evil? Before the great, glorious, and correct laws of history, there is no evil. There is only the respectable darkness behind the light. The brown-haired officer's voice suddenly rose like an angry waterbird. The feathers on the top of his head stood up in fear, and his slender neck made the air flow through it become sharp. In the sharp tone, there was unmistakable contempt and disdain. The waterbird that stepped on the green water grass was looking down at the shellfish below. His words revealed the firmness and pride in his heart, as well as the narcissism that spread from it. In the dark underground room, there seemed to be a light whose color could not be seen. It enveloped the body of this federal officer whose hands were stained with blood, causing his dark green military uniform to sparkle. Only a strong and powerful Central Federation that has the support of all parties can defeat the Empire and lead us to victory. In order to achieve this goal, many people must be eliminated, including the stubborn warlord Zhong Suahu who destroyed the unity of the Federation. Perhaps it was because of Hiyuyu's questioning before his death that made the brown-haired officer feel the anger of his ideals being misunderstood. With a gloomy voice, he said the first part of the sentence with disdain and a hint of excitement. Hiyuyu's face was pale, and his eyes were cloudy and lifeless. He stared at the brown-haired officer who was waving his arms excitedly in the shadows before him. Suddenly, he laughed somewhat nervously and murmured in a low voice, "Is defeating the Empire really that important? This is a matter of life and death, a question that is higher than life and death. In the shadows, the brown-haired officer's nose bridge was high like a sharp sword. He said coldly, "The Empire is a primitive, bloody, and shameless existence. It should have been thrown into the garbage heap of the history of the universe a long time ago. Since you can't change it on your own, let us do it. We are not invaders." The officer said with a heavier tone, "What we need to do is to rescue the people of the lower class of the Empire and let the light of the Constitution cover the entire universe. Humanity will return to peace and have ample time and energy to advance into the depths of the universe. This beautiful and harmonious new era is our historical mission. For this historical mission, anyone can be sacrificed and any means can be allowed. The question is, do the people of the lower class of the Empire need you? Do they crave for you to rescue them?" He leaned against the cold wall, his eyes still devoid of life, but gradually, he finally understood some things. "We just want to do this. We don't need the consent or understanding of the lower class of the Imperium. Our civilization is advanced and superior, so we have the responsibility to help them." The brown-haired officer said coldly, "If we don't persist in doing the right thing just because the other party can't understand it, that would be an irresponsible attitude. The Federation is superior to the Empire because of its charter, rule of law, and the spirit of freedom. What about you? You assassinated the commander of the Federation, sold information to the Empire, and threatened me with the lives of my wife and daughter. My daughter is only 4 years old this year." Hiyuyu's eyes widened as he angrily reprimanded, "In order to win, in order to eliminate those people who are above the law, who are not on the same path as you, you did not hesitate to destroy this spirit and put yourself above the law. What's the difference between you and the people you hate? What right do you have to talk about the injustice of saving the Empire?" These fanatical Federation officers reminded him and woke him up. It turned out that being a citizen of the Empire was not a natural sin. There were sins that were born for various reasons everywhere in this universe. There was a deathly silence in the gloomy underground room. After a long time, the brown-haired officer in the shadows said with a slightly hoarse voice, "So, in the future, we will also be swept into the trash heap of history, but," then he raised his head and said proudly and coldly, "But no matter who writes history in the future, they cannot deny that our actions have pushed this history forward and made our own contributions. We do not fight for days and nights, but only for 10,000 years." In Hiyuyu's eyes, the pride of the brown-haired Federation officer from the bottom of his heart and his expression of martyrdom were just ridiculous and ridiculous fanaticism and excitement. "Crazy, everyone has gone crazy. The world laughs at me for being too crazy, and I laugh at the world for not being able to see through it. Actually, when will I be able to truly see through it?" The brown-haired Federation officer lowered his head for an instant and then raised his head again. Still calm and graceful, there was pride in his confidence. He looked at Hiyuyu and said with a smile, "When we sent you to Bermuda, you could have tried to escape to the Empire, but you did not." Hiyuyu's body stiffened slightly. Thinking of the meeting with the Commissioner of the Imperial Royal Intelligence Agency and his mental struggle at that time, he could not help but clench his fists and sink into the painful memories. "But you did not escape because you could not bear to leave your wife and daughter behind. You were worried about what would happen to them after you escaped." The brown-haired officer smiled and praised, "In this aspect, I admire you very much. For a citizen of the Empire to have the courage to give up the chance to survive for the sake of his family in the Federation." Hiyuyu did not say anything. He lowered his head in silence, thinking of his wife and daughter. He was depressed and sad. He did not know if they would live well after his death. He did not know if they would be able to learn of his death. He did not know if Roos would be able to open that little shop next year. He did not know if his daughter would be able to carry slippers for other men when she grew up. He did not know what would happen to everything he cared about and loved after his death. He did not know at all. It is very difficult for me to trust people as shameless as you, but other than trusting your promise, there is no other way. Yu lowered his head and said, "Speak, what do you want me to do in the end? Don't forget, you promised me to let them live." "It's very simple, end this matter." The brown-haired officer handed over a simple recording pen and a simple black pistol. Yu took the recording pen, but he did not pick up the pistol. He stared in a daze at the black metal pistol on the table. His gaze rose again and fell on the faintly discernible brown hair and straight nose of the officer across from him in the shadows. A few minutes later, there was the sound of a gunshot. The forest on the ground was already dusk. When Shimin-Jin crawled out from the pile of old leaves, what entered his eyes was a red that covered the sky and covered the earth. It was just like the flower of blood that had just burst out from Hiyuyu's forehead. After a slight pause, he leaned against a large tree. He took off his brown wig and lit a cigarette. Looking at the setting sun in the distance and the military prison building in the evening light, he was silent for a long time and sighed slightly. In the end, Hiyu did not pick up the gun and shoot at him. That guy should be a good person. Fortunately, he did not have a family. Otherwise, if it was up to him to choose, between the despair and hatred before death and the safety of his wife and daughter, he really would not know which to choose. Shimin-Jin took a deep drag of the cigarette and thought in the light green smoke. He sat down and leaned against the large tree. He opened the workbench in his hand and quickly operated with his fingers. He turned the relevant information on the computer and the document with Hiyuyu's electronic signature into fragments of information and sent them out into space. From the beginning, they had never thought of killing Hiyu. Hiyu was a seat of the empire in their hands. Furthermore, through Zhongshohu's death, he would win the boundless trust of the empire. For the Federation, this meant an unimaginable amount of benefits. However, they never thought that there would be someone in this world who could surpass the authority of the Bureau of Proclamation and know that they had hidden a seed of the empire. Furthermore, this matter was exposed. Shimin-Jin's brows were deeply furrowed. He pondered bitterly in the twilight and green smoke. According to the information from the Bureau of Proclamation, Sulu had the first sequence authority. The question was, how could he have such a high sequence authority? A burst of rapid footsteps and thunderous roars interrupted his thoughts. "Don't move. Put your hands up. Don't move." More than 20 fully armed and murderous Federation soldiers appeared at the edge of the forest as if they had descended from the sky. They held all kinds of weapons in their hands and surrounded Shimin-Jin in the middle. These clearly well-trained elite soldiers completely controlled the situation as soon as they appeared. However, for some reason, they were still roaring with stern expressions. They seemed to be very nervous. On the contrary, Shimin-Jin, who was surrounded, still had a calm expression. He still held the half-burned cigarette between his fingers. The calmness was just a facade. It was because he was very familiar with this group of soldiers that he could forcefully suppress the shock in his heart and pretend to be indifferent. The Iron 7th Division's Special Guards Battalion, Shimin-Jin's most direct subordinates in the past, actually pointed their guns at him today. "Don't move." The commander of the Iron 7th Division Special Guards Battalion held the Pan Ningwei submachine gun and aimed it between Shimin-Jin's eyebrows. He roared in a hoarse voice, "Battalion commander, don't move, or I'll have to shoot you." The cigarette slipped from between his fingers. Shimin-Jin lowered his head and stepped on it with his military boots. He didn't keep absolutely still according to the request of these soldiers. Instead, he raised his head and stared into the eyes of the commander. He took a step forward and asked in a deep voice, "Do you know what you are doing?" The commander of the Iron 7th Division took a step forward and pointed the cold muzzle between his eyebrows. He said in a hoarse voice, "Battalion commander, I don't know what we are doing, but if you move one more step, I'll really have to shoot. This is the order of the division commander." The other departments in the joint investigation team of the attack on the ancient bell didn't know what was happening in the forest more than 10 kilometers away from the military prison. The officers and soldiers of the Iron 7th Division who participated in the investigation sent their arrested targets back to S1 through a military warship as fast as possible and in the most secretive way. At number 44, Shinma Avenue, Capital Special District, Du Xiaoqing sat in front of his desk and looked at the relevant reports submitted by the joint investigation team with no expression on his face. Behind him, raindrops were tapping on his window, making the light inside and outside a little dim. In front of the wide desk, Shimin Jin stood with his head down. His hands were tied with high-strength plastic ropes, so he couldn't move a finger. Du Xiaoqing didn't look up at him. He just looked at the report in silence. The atmosphere in the room was extremely oppressive. When the oppressive atmosphere was about to suffocate him, he looked up at Shimin Jin and said, "I told you before that there are many methods that I can't accept." Chapter 579. There was an obvious and insurmountable line between light and darkness. The ash between black and white could not be used as an excuse to absolve oneself of guilt. Even if the ash was so faint that it was almost invisible, it would still be black of varying degrees. How could it be white? The talented, cold, proud, and cool Du Xiaoqing had always thought so. However, many years after he graduated from No. 1 Academy, he had been in conflict, struggling, and silent in the military system. He had changed a lot. He understood that no matter how beautiful a landscape painting was, it still needed the dirty natural pigments dug out from the dark mines to be painted. For the bright future of the Federation, or rather, for mankind, he was willing to sacrifice a part of his moral principles. Especially when a hidden and exciting trend of thought appeared in the Federation, and a trustworthy and excellent politician stood at the forefront of the trend, he was more and more sure that this sacrifice would be well rewarded. Therefore, he put all his energy and effort into the construction of the army, giving up worldly happiness such as family. Under the strong suppression of Zhong Shouhu in the West Woods, he still brought out the Iron 7th Division, an iron army, and branded the entire 2nd Military Region with his deep personal brand. The target of the Iron Blood Army was of course the people of the Empire, but for the future of the Federation, Du Xiaoqing did not mind using this army to protect that big shot. In fact, in the past few years, his Iron 7th Division had been cooperating with the relevant departments of the government to carry out some secret plans. His most loyal subordinate, Shimin Jin, was an important contact person for the Iron 7th Division to cooperate with the relevant plans. But what was the bottom line of sacrifice? How many flowers of evil would have to be burned to let the world regain the light of holiness? How many innocent people would have to die? But, not including this. Du Xiaoqing looked at Shimin Jin in front of the table expressionlessly and said in an exceptionally calm tone, "The assassination of Zhong Huiyan at Mulla Manor, you said it was the work of the Special Task Force, so I did not continue to ask. In fact, you and I both know that Chen Yinchuan secretly entered the Lin family after graduating from No. 1 Academy to carry out a secret government mission to infiltrate the 7 great families. Without my order or yours, he would not have taken the risk of exposing his identity to launch this operation." And this time, Du Xiaoqing stood up after a moment of silence and said, "He shouldn't have died like this. This operation has been approved by the higher-ups." Shimin Jin lowered her head slightly and explained in a slightly hoarse voice, "Mr. Councilman, I am not willing to let you participate in these dirty matters, so I hid the specific plan from you. The last confirmed time was when you left room 5460 last time." Du Xiaoqing raised his eyebrows slightly and said coldly, "Are you still my soldier?" "I will always be the commander's soldier." Shimin Jin suddenly raised her head. Then standing straight, she replied loudly, "But I am even more unwilling to let teacher deal with this kind of difficult problem." Difficult problem? Du Xiaoqing suddenly smiled. His smile was full of indescribable bitterness. This is not a problem. His death is like a slap to my face. It will hurt until the day I die. The final decision was made the day before Tiger returned to the West Woods. Shimin-jin's voice was hoarse as she explained, "This warlord will not give up his privileges as a noble family and join our camp. Also, in order to protect the interests of the Zhong family, the West Woods will not completely become a part of the Federation. In order to defeat the vicious enemy of the Empire, we must get rid of him. This is not a personal grudge." He gritted his teeth and looked at his teacher, who was deep in thought. His tone was urgent as he said, "This is for the Federation." Du Shaoqing's usually emotionless eyes suddenly flashed with a trace of nostalgia. His thin lips opened slightly and he said slowly, "For the Federation, this is a very familiar phrase. Back then, in Number 1 Academy, he liked to say this. At the time, I thought it was ridiculous. You will be a local tyrant in the West Woods. What right do you have to tarnish such a hot-blooded phrase? Now, he has really died for the Federation. You are in charge of this investigation, so no one will know the truth of the matter." Shimin-jin noticed that his teacher's mood was a bit strange at this time. His expression was gloomy as he said, "I am not fighting for anything for myself. It is just that if I am found, many people will suspect you." For all the officers and soldiers of the Iron 7th Division, their object of loyalty was the Federation. To be more specific, direct, and firm, it was their teacher Du Shaoqing. Even though Shimin-jin, who worked for some important people in the government, hid many things about Du Shaoqing, in fact, he still fanatically worshipped him. Everything he did pointed to the direction of creating a bright and open dance in the Federation. Under the leadership of his teacher, they would advance into the depths of the universe and conquer a large star region. I don't plan to expose this matter because too many people are involved. Once the truth is exposed, the West Woods will definitely be in chaos. The first civil war in the Federation may break out. When that time comes, how can the chaotic Federation defeat the Empire? Du Shaoqing said coldly, "I am not a perfect person with perfect morals. Whether it is the senator or you all want to put on a pair of white gloves for me, but the hands are already black and can never be clean again. I cannot bear the responsibility of starting a civil war in the Federation, and I am no longer a young man who can't sleep because of his conscience. I don't like Tiger Zhong even more, so it seems that I have no reason to continue investigating." Du Shaoqing slowly opened the drawer and then walked to the front of the table. Outside the window, the rain dripped. The light in the room was dim, and the smooth military uniform gradually changed color with his steps. But he shouldn't have died like this. A strange flush flashed across Du Shaoqing's usually cold face. He stared at Shimin-jin in front of him and roared in a low voice, "He is a soldier of the Federation, a truly outstanding soldier of the Federation. He should have been killed on a real battlefield, or he could have been killed in the valiant civil war of the Federation, but he shouldn't have been killed by the bullets of his comrades in the back because of a mistake that he hadn't committed yet." A crisp spring sound rang out. Du Shaoqing raised the pistol and pointed it between Shimin-jin's brows. He said coldly, "Today, I'll kill you first to return him alive. In the future, when I capture the Emperor of the Empire, I'll return him alive. At that time, we'll meet again in hell." In the depths of the desk drawer behind him, that old-fashioned photo lay quietly. The back was facing up, and the front was kissing the dust. Under the cold black barrel of the gun, Shimin-jin's face was pale, but he didn't move at all. He still stood extremely straight and didn't make any movements to dodge. Only his breathing became hurried. Right at this moment, there was a knock on the door. Knock, knock, knock. It was extremely stable. Du Shaoqing's right hand, which was holding the gun steadily, stiffened slightly. This building was filled with his soldiers. Who was able to quietly come to his door in the middle of a rainy day? The person outside the door didn't wait for the person inside to react. He pushed the door open naturally and entered. His slightly chubby body was wrapped in a raincoat, and the action of closing the door seemed to be somewhat strenuous. This person took off the wet raincoat and threw it on the ground. He then took off the hat that was drenched in the rain and hung it on the clothes rack beside the door. He rubbed his hands lightly, turned around, looked at the two people in front of the table, and said with a smile, "It said that autumn rain is cold, but it's still summer now. After being drenched in the rain, it's terrifyingly cold. What the hell is this weather?" At this time, Du Xiaoqing was still pointing the gun between Shimin Jin's eyebrows. Because of the arrival of this uninvited guest, he didn't pull the trigger, but his slightly stiff right arm was still raised horizontally. He didn't put it down. Taking off the wet hat, it was white hair. This old man who entered Du Xiaoqing's office like he was going home didn't seem to see the tense situation in the room, nor did he see the gun in the air. He looked at Du Xiaoqing and said with a hint of admonishment, "Being able to have such a subordinate who thinks for you in all aspects and doesn't even hide when facing your gun proves your ability to lead troops. Isn't it also your luck? You should cherish such a subordinate, and not die because of a moment of impulse and rare lack of calmness. Otherwise, in the future, you will definitely doubt yourself and feel sad like you are now." Du Xiaoqing's eyes slightly lowered, but he still didn't put down the gun in his hand. The old man with white hair ignored him and said calmly, "Let's start the meeting. Although I'm very unwilling to take over this work, since His Excellency the President asked me to handle all the specific matters of this investigation, I have to care about it." Du Xiaoqing's sword-like eyebrows slightly twitched, and blue veins appeared. He finally put down the gun in his hand and said in a heavy tone, "Yes, Mr. Vice President." Vice President Byron of the Federation convened the first joint meeting of the Joint Investigation Team of the attack on the Antique Bell. Because it was called at the last minute, the director of the Investigation Department of the Federation and the officers of the other two departments couldn't attend in time. They just received a briefing after the meeting. Very few people attended this joint meeting. Few people could imagine that the first meeting of the Joint Investigation Team actually became a gathering of the culprits of this conspiracy. This was an absurd and extremely cold fact. The association hasn't had a gathering for many years. Vice President Byron, who was sitting in the middle of the bench, said, "But I don't enjoy this kind of gathering, because I feel uneasy when I think that the Bureau of Proclamation may know every word we say." In the dim room, a voice sounded. Although Cui Zedong had issued a warning in advance, we still didn't expect Su Li's unexpected situation to happen. I'm really shocked that this person's sequence authority is actually higher than Cui Zedong's, and he can even make the charter computer restart the investigation. Vice President Byron leaned forward slightly, and light and shadow interlaced on his old face. He said in a heavy voice, "Even if Su Lo has the first sequence authority, according to the privacy protection regulations of citizens, he can't have access to certain content. How on earth did he bypass the regulations?" Cui Zedong tried to find the reason before he was replaced, but he didn't find anything. Also, according to the information from the interrogation room, he was preparing to commit suicide. There was silence in the dim room. The person who was about to become the director of the Bureau of Proclamation of the Federation, and in a sense, the most powerful man, didn't hesitate to commit suicide when facing the interrogation. This shocked everyone present. I strongly disagree with this. His position in the Bureau of Proclamation is very important to our plan. Although I admire his courage, this is not the best way to solve the problem. Chapter 580. The gloomy room was incomparably quiet. These figures hidden in the darkness were most likely all important figures in the Federation. However, other than Vice President Byron, who was sitting at the head of the table, no one else could be seen clearly. Many years ago, this loose organization had already existed. At first, it was just a high-level association that focused on the exchange of academic knowledge. Later on, without anyone noticing, it secretly relaxed the standards for joining the association. It gradually began to have specific goals and became incomparably powerful. The association was incomparably powerful because every single one of its members was extremely powerful. These members who could call the wind and summon the rain in different areas of the Federation possessed intelligence and abilities that ordinary people could not imagine. Just like the wind, clouds, thunder, and lightning at the top of the dome of heaven, once gathered together, they would release extremely terrifying energy. Only this group of people dared to weave such a conspiracy with no expression on their faces. Only this group of people dared to borrow the power of the Empire to murder a Federation commander. In the entire plan, they had made meticulous arrangements for all possible contingencies. They had even noticed the problem of Su Li's sequence authority changing. However, everyone, including Cui Zedong, had still underestimated the severity of this problem. As a result, they had paid a disastrous price. Cui Zedong was the future director of the Bureau of Proclamation and the most important member of the association. Now that he was under investigation, in order to protect him, someone in the association had to sacrifice themselves without hesitation. That a day later, a clear gunshot rang out from a certain room on the top floor of the Federation's Department of Defense building. A few years ago, in an adjacent room, a clear gunshot had also rang out. That day, the former Deputy Minister of the Department of Defense, Yang Jingsong, had committed suicide in anger because of the assassination at the Linhai State Gymnasium. He had left behind an angry will. The one who had committed suicide today was the director of the Department of Defense's Office No. 1, who was also the personal secretary of Minister Zhou Yingxing, Lieutenant Colonel Zhao. Secretary Zhao had also left behind a will. Minister of Defense Zhou Yingxing looked at Secretary Zhao, who had collapsed in a pool of blood. He slowly took off his glasses, lowered his head, and pinched the space between his eyebrows. He then handed the will in his hand to the officer beside him. In his last words, Secretary Zhao admitted that he had used the electronic code in the minister's office without permission and forged a secret military intelligence plan. He requested the Bureau of Proclamation to cooperate and temporarily stop the investigation of the seed of the Empire. As for why he had done so, there was no answer in his last words. At this point, the investigation of the attack on the ancient Bell ship had finally made a breakthrough, but it was also put to an end by the cold death of this person. Cui Zedong, the assistant director of the Bureau of Proclamation, was cleared of most of the suspicion and left the investigation camp that night. What awaited him was an extremely long vacation. Minister Zhou Yingxing stood by the floor-to-ceiling window in his office and looked down at the capital special district. He was silent for a long time. His hands were behind his back, and he seemed to feel the blood stains from Secretary Zhao's suicide note between his fingers. In just one day, he seemed to have aged a lot. Both his body and spirit had suffered an extremely heavy blow. Secretary Zhao had been following him since he was the head of the department in the General Assembly base. The relationship between the two had long surpassed the relationship between a superior and a subordinate. However, who would have thought that this person had other intentions in his heart? Today, it was even more dismal. They are very powerful, and they are gradually becoming more powerful. Minister Zhou looked at the heavy rain outside the window expressionlessly and muttered to himself, "Who can stop them? Or should we stop them?" Over the years, the hardliners within the Federation government and the military were gradually rising. In the deepest undercurrent, there was even an extremely dangerous tendency of the military to interfere in the political affairs. Zhong Shouhu had noticed this serious problem, and Zhou Yingxing had naturally smelled this trace of smell. He could even vaguely guess who the other party was. However, he did not have enough evidence, nor did he have the power to change anything. Because he did not know the real attitude of the president's residents and the people in Philadelphia toward this kind of ideology, West Woods region, Sunset State. Dozens of dark green military vehicles were connected in front and back, moving slowly and silently on the streets. The red and white military license plates hanging on the vehicles were now covered by thick black gauze, allowing the people of the West Woods on the streets to guess the origin of this motorcade. There was no rushing to tell others, no joy, no sobbing. The people of the West Woods stood in the windows of the buildings, in the bushes by the streets, and in the back of the small trucks, silently and sorrowfully watching the silent and sorrowful motorcade drive toward the old house in Latitude 2 district. In addition to the silence and sorrow, there was also endless frustration and emptiness that pervaded the streets and alleys. The little princess of the West Woods had finally returned home, but under such circumstances. Although the little girl in the motorcade had inherited the proud bloodline of the Zhong family, she was still a little girl. How could her thin and timid shoulders bear so much pressure? In the back of the bulletproof military vehicle, Fatty Tian looked at the little girl beside him and said gently, "Don't sleep. Watch TV for a while. We're almost there." This strong man, who had been retired for many years, naturally took over the heavy responsibility of taking care of the little princess of the Zhong family. Perhaps it was because of the pressure and anger that caused him to overeat. He appeared to be fatter than before. His eyes were slightly narrowed, like the cracks on a white wall. There was no mischievous or comical expression in those cracks, only cold and valiant. Zhong Huiyan's eyes were actually not as big as Su Lu remembered, but they were unusually bright and fresh. She sat quietly in the back seat, and under her black hair that slowly rose and fell like a watermelon skin, there was a trace of melancholy and sorrow that did not match her age in her lovely crescent-like eyes. "I don't want to watch TV. It's all about Father's documentaries." She bit her lip and said stubbornly, "Those are all fake." Immediately, she lowered her head weakly and stared blankly at the doll in her arms that was so old that it was about to break off. Her clear and childish voice trembled slightly, and her eyes were red as she said, "They all lied to me and said that they would take me home to see rabbits. Now that I'm back, where are they? Brother Sulu promised me that Mom would be back soon, but now, even he can't come back." The little girl turned her head sadly, and her shoulders trembled slightly. She was like a sensitive girl who was too proud and mature to show her true emotions to others. Only when she tilted her head slightly and gently rubbed her cheek against the old doll did she reveal her true age. Mr. Tian silently looked at the back of the little girl, took a deep breath silently, and turned his head to the other side of the car window. He looked at the remaining burn marks on the car window, and a trace of palpitating emotion flashed across his round face. He took out his phone and asked in a deep voice, "Where are you?" "Just ahead." Traffic control had already been carried out on the straight streets of the capital of Sunset State. The dark green military vehicle steadily moved forward under the complicated gazes of the West Woods citizens. At this moment, a series of heavy mechanical rumbles suddenly sounded in front of the streets, and the vibrations caused the leaves on the streets to begin to tremble. Hundreds of armored vehicles surged in from all directions and quickly approached the military vehicles. The earth trembled. The two sides met in an extremely short period of time, and the order was extremely good. However, the overwhelming aura of iron still made the onlookers feel an uncontrollable panic. At this time, the dark green fleet finally tore off the exterior of the tarpaulin camouflage. The heavy firepower weapons in the rear compartments of dozens of military vehicles were clearly visible, displaying their power without any concealment. The thick, cold, black metal pipes were vigilantly aimed at the sky, the ground, and every corner of the streets. The heavily guarded fleet moved forward 3 kilometers, and another 70 or so black MX mechas of the latest model joined the fleet with a roar. "Forward, forward, forward." The silent and valiant army escorted the little girl in the center of the fleet as they moved forward toward the old mansion in Way 2 District. At the same time, the two reorganized machinists stationed in the southwest military camp of the capital of Sunset State had already left their station. They silently, brazenly, and murderously entered the city. Tens of thousands of fully armed soldiers, thousands of various war vehicles, and hundreds of heavy alloy mechas became an irresistible iron stream, paralyzing the entire city's traffic and daily operations. Immediately after, the reorganized machinist master announced on behalf of a certain party that from that day onward, the capital of Sunset State, within a radius of 80 kilometers around the old mansion in Way 2 District, would become a military control zone. No entry without permission. The phone calls from the Westwoods office of the Department of Defense and the Westwoods Military Staff Department kept ringing, but the two machinists did not respond at all. Finally, these calls directly reached the dark green fleet that was slowly returning home. On the phone, the angry general sternly questioned Stick Tian what he was going to do. "You know why?" Stick Tian glanced at the little girl beside him, the fat on his lower jaw trembling slightly, and said, "This is for the safety of the little girl. If you don't dare to come and disarm, then pretend you didn't see this scene. I know, His Excellency the President will be here soon. I left half the city for you to prepare for the ceremony. Is there any other problem?" There was silence on the other end of the phone. No matter how angry the general was, after hearing this incomparably valiant announcement, he still could only remain silent. Because the one who said this was Fatty Tian. Even though this Fatty Tian had long retired from the army, even though he was only a colonel when he retired, he could still command the military strength of 3 divisions with just one phone call. No one in the Westwoods dared to doubt this. After Stick Tian hung up the phone, he shook his head. He was not used to being arrogant, and letting 3 machinists ignore the military order of the Federation and enter the city in large numbers had long exceeded the meaning of arrogance on the surface. But he had to do this. Only in this way could those who had bad intentions be more honest. The commander was dead, so the little girl could return to the Westwoods. This was very sad and very infuriating. But what was even more sad and infuriating was that on the way home, in the space station at the border of the region, they actually encountered an accident that was definitely not an accident. If the Special Task Force staff sent by the president had not gotten the relevant information, things might have been a little troublesome. He glanced at Zhong Huiyan, somewhat clumsily picked up the school bag beside her, and said, "Do you still have to do homework today?" Zhong Huiyan turned her head, and there was no expression on her young face. She nodded and said, "Yes, I have to study harder in the future, because I have to take care of myself." Chapter 581. Stop. In a quiet and noble manner on the outskirts of the capital of the Westwoods Sunset State, a cold shout rang out. On both sides of the road under the cover of the trees, black gun barrels poked out and aimed at a few soldiers who were walking quickly along the road. In the face of the tight defense and deadly weapons, the soldiers did not stop at all. Even the determined expression on their faces did not change. They followed the burly figure at the front and approached the building. The few of them were not imposing, but they were as firm as a mountain. Li Feng's footsteps were firm. His military boots were shiny, and his military uniform was neat. There was no expression on his face, but there was a sense of ruthlessness between his eyebrows that made people's hearts palpitate. Hundreds of fully armed personnel rushed out from under the building hidden among the green trees, blocking in front of him and his subordinates. The black barrels of the guns were closer, but Li Feng didn't even look at these people. He waved his right hand and forcefully pushed away the barrels of the guns. He walked in with loud strides. Inside the building, the Zhong family was holding an extremely important meeting. The elders of the family and the people with real power needed to determine the distribution of power after the unexpected death of the head of the family as soon as possible. They needed to stabilize the internal situation and seek for the longevity of the family. However, Li Feng, an outsider, barged into the meeting without reason. Under the disbelieving gazes of the well-dressed people, he walked directly to the deepest part of the room. An old man of the Zhong family who was presiding over the meeting slowly stood up and frowned. He was about to say something, but his old and cloudy eyes suddenly shrank. Li Feng walked in front of the hesitant Zhong Ziki with an expressionless face. He took out the old-style gun at his waist. Without the slightest hesitation or a word, he directly pulled the trigger at Zhong Ziki's thigh. The crisp sound of the gunshot reverberated in the quiet meeting room, but it shook everyone's mind. Their ears were buzzing, and their minds were in chaos. There was absolute silence. There seemed to be no sound of tables and chairs overturning, no sound of Zhong Ziki screaming and falling to the ground, no sound of blood spurting out from his thigh. There was only the sound of a gunshot. This simple and straightforward gunshot shattered everyone's ability to think. The entire Federation referred to this young lieutenant colonel as Mad Manly, because he was insufferably arrogant and crazy in battle, but no one thought that he was a true madman, until now. He walked in with his chest puffed out and pulled out his pistol expressionlessly. As if he was waving his hand to swat away a fly, he pulled the trigger without hesitation and shot the second young master, who was most likely to become the head of the Westwoods Zhong family, to the ground. The silence was broken by cries of surprise, curses, and shouts. The security personnel of the Zhong family in the Westwoods rushed over, roaring with heavy weapons in their hands, but no one dared to shoot, and no one dared to stand in front of Zhong Ziki. This was because Li Feng was still holding a gun in his broad right hand. His light yellow calluses were firmly in contact with the patterned gun handle. The distance between the slender muzzle and Zhong Ziki's forehead was so short that even a needle couldn't penetrate it. There was another important reason why there wasn't an intense gunfight or a bloodbath. Zhong Ziki was clutching his thigh as he fell to the ground. His face was pale from the pain, and his facial features were contorted. His eyes were filled with horror, but he still didn't forget to shout loudly, "Don't shoot." He knew Mad Manly very well. Even if the Zhong family security personnel blasted the officers into a bloody pulp, Mad Manly would definitely rush to kill him first. What was even more terrifying was that the deafening gunshot clearly proved that if Mad Manly wanted to kill him today, he wouldn't even need to think twice. I don't want to care about the bullshit matters of you aristocratic families, but fireworks are the only flesh and blood of a tiger. Li Feng stared at Zhong Ziki's contorted face under the muzzle of the gun. He enunciated each word clearly. If something like what happened in the space station happens again, if your sister loses a single strand of hair, I don't care if you did it or not, I will kill you. I didn't do it, Zhong Ziki shouted in pain. You can insult my intelligence, but don't overestimate my rationality. I've already said that I don't care if you did it or not. I'll settle the score with you. Li Feng used the muzzle of the gun to stab Zhong Ziki's forehead as he roared, "If you want to be the head of the family, the Westwoods will be yours. In the Westwoods, if anything happens to your sister, who else would I look for if not you? I don't care what fucking evidence you have." After saying this, he put the gun back into his holster and glared at Zhong Ziki on the ground. He couldn't be bothered to say anything else. With a bang of his military boots on the ground, he prepared to turn around and leave. The Zhong family's big shots, who had been shocked and silent until this moment, finally reacted. The family elder who stood up shakily was so angry that his whole body was trembling. He pointed at the back of Li Feng's head and scolded, "How dare you? Arrest this lunatic." The Zhong family's armed men approached again with nervous expressions. A few heavy firearms even directly stuck to Li Feng's gradually losing childishness. One of the guns with a metallic luster was directly pressed against Li Feng's forehead. The soldier holding the gun had a ruthless expression. He wanted to use this action to return the humiliation that the family successor had suffered to him. His cheek made intimate contact with the cold barrel of the gun. Li Fang's eyes suddenly flashed with madness. With a muffled shout, he slammed his head against the barrel of the gun between his eyebrows. The moment he lowered his head, a huge force collided with the metal gun, causing it to suddenly change shape with a creaking sound. The hard gun butt flew backward and directly hit the soldier's chest. The ruthless soldier couldn't react at all. Accompanied by the terrifying sound of his sternum cracking, he directly fainted. A micro-controlled gun can't even fake a misfire. Li Feng fiercely spat. He suddenly turned around and looked at the Zhong family's big shots. He rolled his eyes and said, "What I just said to Zhong Ziki is also what I said to you old men. If anything happens to Zhong Huiyan in the West Woods again, you all will be buried with her." He stretched out his arrogant index finger and pointed at the old man of the Zhong family, who was covering his chest and coughing. He said, "You old dogs only know how to hide behind a tiger and pick up rotten meat to eat. Since you don't dare to kill me because of my old man, then be more honest in the future. You must be very eager for my old man to die early so that you can deal with me. But I have to remind you that when the day comes that you dare to kill me, maybe I will be very willing to kill all of you in advance." Li Feng's face was ferocious. He looked around at the several generations of elites of the Zhong family and said coldly, "So you'd better pray that my old man will live forever, or that Zhong Huiyan will always be healthy." The expressions of the people of the Zhong family were extremely complicated and embarrassed. They had to admit that what Li Feng said was true. For these thousand-year-old families, the Li family by Lake Feiqing was just the condensation of brilliance that occasionally bloomed in the long river of history. However, in the past few decades, the Li family, which was sparsely populated, had become more powerful than the 7 families because the highest mountain in the Federation was still spreading light and shadow in the universe. The military boots stepped on the ground paved with precious stones, making clear and firm footsteps. Li Feng walked out of the venue indifferently with his subordinate officers. His voice was not loud today, but when it gushed out from his burly and magnificent chest, it was as deafening as heavenly thunder. Until his back disappeared at the door, these words still echoed in the venue and fell on the heavy hearts of people on the ground, smashing countless bloody holes. Just like Zhong Ziki's miserable thigh, the most important thing in the world was life and death, and the most common thing was also life and death. When an ordinary person died, it would often make the hearts of relatives linger in grief for a few days, while the unrelated people would only care about their own happiness. But the death of a big shot was different. The length of the human mourning seemed to be proportional to the weight of the dead person. The sudden death of Zhong Suohu and his wife, in addition to triggering thoughts of mourning in the Federation and the continuous sad weather in the West Woods for many days, would inevitably lead to more complicated and more serious problems because they left behind a jaw-dropping legacy, including the huge industrial cluster of the ancient clock company, but more importantly, the right of the head of the Zhong family to dispose of the family property and the military power of the West Woods. Tacitly acknowledged by the Federation. So far, no will had been found, so how should the legacy be dealt with? 2 partners of the largest law firm in the West Woods chose to resign because they could not bear the huge pressure. The West Woods troops in several galaxies were also anxiously watching. According to the laws of the Federation, the only daughter of Commander Zhong and his wife, Zhong Huohua, had the unquestionable right of first inheritance. But the problem was that the legacy could not be inherited completely according to the laws of the Federation to a large extent. For example, the exercise of military power was not allowed by the Federation laws at all. Also, the family property of the Zhong family that had existed for thousands of years, the head of the family had the absolute right to dispose of it, but it did not mean that it was the personal property of the head of the family. How could these troublesome legacies, which made the relationship between the Federation and the West Woods, be inherited by a little girl? At this time, many people in the West Woods thought of Zhong Ziki, the nephew who was most doted on and even spoiled by Commander Zhong, and in the hearts of many people over the years, the next head of the family. Gradually, there was a great difference of opinion between the Zhong family and the troops, and cracks were gradually forming. In the face of such a crazy legacy, all kinship, love, and friendship were all bubbles, and all kinds of tricks were possible. Fortunately, Li Feng used his madness and Big Stick Tian used his strength to suppress this trend before the frightening and dangerous situation descended into total madness. The people and soldiers of the West Woods anxiously waited for the result. The continuous heavy rain carried the cold wind through countless tall buildings. At this time, the president of the Federation, Mr. Pabre, arrived in the Sunset State of the West Woods region. The funeral was about to begin. Chapter 582. The melodious military music gradually stopped, and the crisp sound of gunshots echoed in the air, shuttling through the dense raindrops, startling the birds that were grooming their wet feathers around the square. It seemed that the weather during a funeral was always bad, and the cold rain was like God crying. In the cold rain, President Pabre's speech in front of the battlefield cemetery was probably the only warm color. His speech touched many people, comforted many people, and made many people cry. After the West Woods Tiger's funeral ended, the president did not rest. He immediately met with the real power figures of the Zhong family and had lunch with them. In the middle of the night, he summoned Big Stick Tian and a couple of young officers from Silan's military. The meeting lasted an entire 3 hours. The next day, 2 of the 3 divisions of mechanics that forced their way into the capital of Sunset State and announced that they were under military control retreated back to the military camp. The old house in Latitude 2 district finally opened its door again. The people who had received some kind of promise from the president chose to compromise in peace. After President Pabre's tireless mediation, the situation in the West Woods that was about to explode finally eased. To ensure the stability of the West Woods, the Zhong family, whose people were unstable, had to be appeased. Some interests could be sacrificed, and some limits could be compromised. After all, those interests that were compromised never really belonged to the Federation government. The Federation would never give a clear suggestion on who would inherit the Zhong family's huge family business. They only showed a slight inclination in the dark. For a long time in the future, the fight for the Zhong family's property would become more complicated. It would definitely be brought to court, and it would be a grand and long-lasting battle. There would be an uproar, and there would be a lot of ugliness. However, as long as the military was not used and the matter was resolved in a relatively peaceful way, it would not affect the Federation's rare goods situation, and it would not affect the galactic war that was about to start, then it would be fine. Compared to the ownership of the Gu Zhong Company and those industrial clusters, the real problem was the selection of the commander of the West Woods military region. The Zhong family had controlled the military power in the West Woods for thousands of years, and this was their biggest reliance and bottom line. Although the Zhong family, which was gradually splitting up, needed the support of the Federation government, they would not give up this bottom line. Perhaps he could seize this opportunity to change some things. The people of the West Woods would never agree to let Du Shaoqing serve in the West Woods military headquarters, so who should they send? President Pabre stood silently by the window, looking at the blue sky, silver sand under his feet and the drizzling rain, thinking about his trip to the West Woods. The top floor of the Golden Star Hotel was silent, and the world outside was equally silent except for the sound of the rain. This planet far away from the capital ring finally had a moment of respite after that tragedy, but the most powerful man in the Federation still could not find a moment to relax. No matter what the situation is, a politician should remain absolutely calm. Only then can they ensure that they are not defeated by weakness and that their decisions are correct so that they can seek happiness and benefits for the majority of the people. I don't know if it's because of Commander Zhong's funeral. President Pobre said in a deep voice as he looked at the rain outside the glass curtain wall and the faint reflection of the shadows. A hand gently patted his left shoulder, and the president's wife comforted him. Sometimes there is no other way to make some compromises. President Pobre knew that his wife must have misunderstood that he was frustrated because he decided to support the other side of the Zhong family. He could not help but smile bitterly, gently patted the warm hand on his shoulder, and whispered to himself in a low voice, "Sometimes the sacrifices we are forced to make may be far more serious than compromises." The president's wife looked at his back worriedly and found that her husband seemed to be in a bad mood, so she quickly changed the topic and said quickly, "My daughter called again yesterday. She is very concerned about Lieutenant Colonel Su Li's situation." "How should I answer?" President Pobre thought of his daughter who was still troubled by depression, and thought of the young man whose fate was unknown. A trace of sadness flashed across his tanned face, and he said in a sincere tone, "I can only pray for that guy's good luck." It was also raining in the capital special district of S1. Teacher Du Xiaoqing watched the live broadcast of the funeral with a somewhat complicated expression. After a long time of silence in the dark room, he walked to the bookshelf, took down the violin case, and began to play the violin. The refreshing violin melody became somewhat different in the hands that were no longer stable and were slightly trembling. The notes that were flowing, struggling, and colliding in the space gathered together and then separated resolutely, revealing a faint sadness, deep panic, and speechless confusion. The emotions were extremely complicated. The melody stopped without warning. Du Xiaoqing stared blankly at the green leaves outside the window that were being tormented by the heavy rain. His usual straight posture seemed to be somewhat stooped. His military posture, which had never had anything wrong with it, seemed to be somewhat gloomy. He suddenly roared and smashed the expensive violin hard on the window lattice, smashing the glass into pieces and splashing everywhere like rain. That night, Du Xiaoqing hastily wrote a report of the preliminary investigation results, and at the same time attached his resignation letter to the office of the president's residence, suggesting that the Parliament Hill continue to investigate the attack of the ancient bell. In the early morning of the next day, he returned to S3 with several orderlies to prepare for the war with the Empire. As long as the situation in the West Woods was stabilized, the federal forces would launch a large-scale attack on the Empire. After the Empire shamelessly attacked the ancient bell, no force or faction in the Federation dared to stop the determination of the president and the military. Otherwise, the anger of the people would directly burn them to ashes. Before boarding the warship, Du Xiaoqing suddenly turned around, took off his sunglasses, and revealed his cold and proud face. He looked at the capital special district in the morning rain with a complicated expression and suddenly asked, "Is there any news from Su Lu?" Reporting to the commander, "There is no news." Du Xiaoqing put on his sunglasses again and remained silent. From the time he put on this pair of sunglasses, he was no longer so obsessed with the starry sky above his head and some things deep in his heart. Once he started to compromise, he might be forced to continue to compromise. It was this cognition that made him think of Su Lu, the young man who made him very unhappy. Now that the hardest stone in the Federation had died, it seemed to be a pity, somewhere far away from the ordinary people's living area in the Federation, there was a secluded manor deep in the mountains and blue lakes. This manor belonged to the Nanxiang family, the most low-key of the 7 families. However, looking at the manor's vast area and luxurious furnishings, how could it be considered low-key? "I heard that someone from the government said that the official residence is very happy to see Zhong Ziki inherit the position of the head of the Zhong family." Nan Xiangmei clenched her fists, opened her bright eyes, and looked at her mother in shock. Her beautiful cheeks were stained with a few strands of black hair that were wet from the rain. In order to pacify the situation in the West Woods as soon as possible, Mr. President made such a hint in advance. After all, the little girl of the Zhong family is too young, and she has been living in the Xixia state, and Zhong Ziki has the support of most of the Zhong family members. Mrs. Nan looked at her daughter with a smile. She knew very well why her daughter, who insisted on living an ordinary life since childhood, suddenly came home today and raised doubts about the situation in the Federation. This was naturally because the young man had an extremely close relationship with the little princess of the Zhong family, but Zhong Huiyan is the legal heir. Nan Xiangmei shook her head in disbelief. Everyone in the West Woods knows that Commander Zhong dotes on Zhong Ziki very much. Many people see that young man as the future head of the Zhong family. In fact, in our view, that tiger seems to have some kind of intention. He wants the heir of the Zhong family to have to die in S1. In this case, the government's choice of Zhong Ziki may be in line with the tiger's last wish. I don't believe it. Nan Xiangmei shook her head firmly. The government is not a kind person, and I know that the Tai family, the Leaf family, and even our family have sent people to the West Woods. Everyone's reaction is very strange. After a moment of silence, Mrs. Nan calmly replied, "You're right. Zhong Ziki can't become an excellent family head in a short period of time. The Zhong family has no leader, and now there are signs of division. The government is secretly adding fuel to the fire. Maybe this is the precursor of the first collapse of the 7 families. In this case, the 6 families must be the first to enter the West Woods to seek benefits. If the Zhong family is destroyed, what good will it do to the other families?" Nan Xiangmei asked sadly, "The relationship between lips and teeth, don't the elders of the family know better than I do? The Zhong family has always been on the edge of the 7 family system. They have no marriage alliance with us, and there are no deep interests entanglement. More importantly, if the Zhong family is really going to decline, we can't just sit back and watch the government absorb the energy released when the Zhong family scatters like a black hole." Nan Xiangmei frowned, looked at her mother and said sadly, "I heard that you and Mrs. Zhong were very good friends. Can't you do something for her daughter? You don't understand, everything is for the sake of interests, for survival." Mrs. Nan slightly closed her eyes, and after a long silence, she continued, "For a giant family like the 7 families, even if they decline and collapse, it will not be a matter of a short period of time. This long process may last for a whole constitutional era. It is also possible that the Zhong family will suddenly rise halfway, just like the history of the East Woods when they were almost destroyed. But in the face of this unprecedented situation, everyone must plunge into it to seize benefits and strengthen themselves, otherwise, it may be our turn to decline next." Nan Xiangmei didn't express any more opinions on this issue, and just looked at her mother with some disappointment and sadness. She looked up and worriedly looked at her daughter, who had obviously lost a lot of weight. She knew where her disappointment and sadness came from. This was because of the love, this was because she was looking for the last bit of hope. However, Mrs. Nan didn't say anything in the end. Nan Xiangmei returned to her own small courtyard behind the lake. She sat quietly and sadly by the window, looking at the countless small circles created by the rain hitting the lake. She thought of the similar circles she saw on the pond in the forest garden that day. These days, it seemed that the entire Federation, and the land of countless planets, was raining, and the patter made people feel depressed and gloomy. Nan Xiangmei glanced at the phone in her hand and dialed a string of numbers with trembling fingertips. After getting this phone number from Li Xiaotong, she hadn't dialed it even once. Today was the first time, but there was no sound from the other end of the phone. Crystal tears fell from the front of her eyelashes, and more, forming a bead curtain and dripping to the ground. She reached out to wipe them, but more tears poured out from her fingers. Chapter 583. Mr. President personally stepped in to mediate, and the government and parliament exerted a lot of pressure. Finally, the situation in the West Woods did not get out of control. At least for the time being, the 2 sides of the family did not have an intense and uncontrollable armed conflict. Some of the fights that revolved around big interests dived into the depths of the sea, brewing endless pressure, while some surfaced above the blue waves and began to move toward legal solutions. Among the huge industries, including the Gu Zhong Company, which belonged to the Zhong family, and which belonged to the private property of the old mansion in the Weifang district, countless complicated legal terms and definitions of authority were enough to make the judges of the entire West Woods a headache. Many people thought that this lawsuit might go all the way to the Supreme Court. The Federation government and the military did not want to see this situation go on for too long. After all, the universe war was coming soon. The various forces faintly sent out vague messages, but it was enough for the parties involved to be very clear. These messages were not good news for the little girl in the old mansion in the Weifang district. The government hoped that the chaos in the West Woods would end as soon as possible. The military hoped that after the civil issues were resolved, they could immediately deal with the jurisdiction of the troops in the West Woods. The 6 families hidden in the shadows watched indifferently and waited for the aftermath of the Zhong family split. The few most powerful forces in the entire Federation pushed the situation to develop in a certain direction for different reasons. Although the Federation's judicial system was claimed to be absolutely independent, in the face of such terrifying pressure, the so-called independence could only guarantee some procedural fairness on the surface. The 3 jurisdictional disputes that started one after another in more than 10 days were extremely unfavorable to the old mansion of the Zhong family. The old mansion's legal counsel, those famous lawyers in the West Woods, could not help but feel a little powerless in the face of such a situation. Under such circumstances, on an ordinary street in the Sunset region in the afternoon, a law firm called Shizhou quietly opened for business. No one noticed that this law firm, which only had 3 shared offices and was not well known in the industry, only had one office. No one knew that the first business the Shizhou law firm sought after its opening was to come to the old mansion of the Zhong family in the Weifang district. If I'm not mistaken, you mean that this law firm called Shizhou wants to represent Miss Zhong Huiyan in all her legal affairs in the future? The staff of the Zhong family's old mansion looked at the young lawyer who had obviously just graduated from university. His expression was extremely strange. The young man opposite him was a little restless. He probably knew who Miss Zhong Huiyan was and what kind of situation the Zhong family was in. The other party actually wanted to represent Miss in all her legal affairs. This was a ridiculous request. Was the boss of this law firm out of his mind? Was he trying to make a name for himself with such a clown request? Do you know how many barristers serve the young lady? Do you know what kind of status these great lawyers have in the West Woods? Do you know that even the famous lawyer he from S1 is currently on his way to the West Woods? The staff member of the Zhong family looked at the young lawyer opposite him and frowned. Your law firm has just been established. What gives you the confidence to let us choose you over these famous lawyers? The young lawyer rubbed his hands nervously and explained in a trembling voice, I know. It seems to be impossible to explain. It's just that the partner of the law firm asked us to get this business. He suddenly thought of something and hurriedly took out a plant fiber business card from the inside of his clothes. He respectfully handed it over and said, We are a small law firm. The boss has no intention of recruiting partners for the time being. The staff member of the Zhong family took the expensive business card and looked at the name on it. He frowned slightly and turned to leave. In less than a minute, the staff member hurriedly came back and looked at the young lawyer in disbelief. He said, Colonel Tian said that he hopes to meet with the boss of your law firm as soon as possible. As for the matter you just mentioned, from today onwards, all the legal affairs of the old mansion will be handed over to the Shizhou law firm. Tai Ziyuan stood in the narrow office of the law firm and looked at the traffic outside the window. There was a smile on his thin and slightly pale face. A month ago, he came to the West Woods and quietly watched the tragedies, comedies, and clowns, but he didn't make a sound. According to the life plan that his mother had suggested and the self-awareness that he had cultivated since he was very young, he should have stayed in the army at this time to seek military exploits in the war against the Imperium in the future. Then, he should have joined the grassroots to accumulate experience and finally officially entered the political world. He should have chosen an important and symbolic state and become a member of that state. He should not have opened a small law firm in the quiet civilian district of the Sunset State as he was now. He didn't give up the first step of his life plan, to become the youngest president of the Federation in history. He just went against his mother's wishes and chose another path that might be more difficult to take. He admitted that he was indeed influenced by the life experience of the president to become a successful lawyer and then enter the political world. In order to become a successful lawyer, one would need to fight a significant lawsuit. Throughout the entire Federation, was there any lawsuit that was more important than the lawsuit of the Silin-Zhong family in the past few decades? Winning or losing this case didn't depend on the case. The sudden appearance of the Shizhou law firm was undoubtedly a strong warning to the Federation government, to the other forces of the Zhong family, and to the other families. Because it seemed to represent the attitude of Macho Back Mountain. In fact, this was the first time that Tai Ziyuan was independent of Macho Back Mountain and made his voice heard to the entire Federation. He completely went against the decision of his mother. Tai Ziyuan looked out of the window and smiled but didn't say anything. Perhaps no one in the universe could defeat his mother, but he wasn't worried about anything. He was the only son in the family for 7 generations. His mother couldn't watch him waste his life out of anger. In this battle between mother and son, the son would always win. Of course, in order to gain the understanding of his mother and the full support of his family, he also made a great compromise. The date of the engagement was finally set for the autumn of the year after next year. He was still the clear-headed, calm, and naturally proud prince, but he suddenly changed his life plan and made such an important decision. Even he himself didn't know if it was some kind of inexplicable sense of responsibility that emerged from the depths of his heart, some kind of desire to complete what he wanted to do for his dead friend, or just he wanted to experience the feeling of living like that guy. Tai Ziyuan looked up at the sky and sighed softly. He said softly in his heart, "You finally became a damned hero. But do you know how many people in the Federation are mocking your stupidity, your vain individualism, and even angrily accusing you of taking revenge for no reason? I really don't understand why these people are angry. Have they never found out that you are mentally ill?" Tai Ziyuan coughed softly, took out a bottle of medicine, and swallowed it. He didn't drink water, and then he held his chest and breathed rapidly for a moment. He finally calmed down, and his cheeks gradually became rosy. In fact, all these years, he hadn't been very close to that guy. The fake gentleness and indifference nurtured by the family since childhood, the natural aura nurtured by the glory of the royal family, and that guy's stubborn and sharp personality were somewhat conflicting. Even if they didn't see each other, they wouldn't miss each other. When they occasionally met, peace would slowly spread like a small stream. But once they never met again, when he thought about how his only friend in this life was gone, he would always feel sad, but he thought that was all. "I want to eat scallion pancakes today." Tai Ziyuan turned around and said to butler Jean, who was standing respectfully at the door of the office. Then he subconsciously paused and smiled inexplicably. Plain porridge and scallion pancakes, the battle in the library, seemed to be something from many years ago. Recently, the Federation's news channel broadcasted the footage of the Bureau of Proclamation's heroic and valiant revenge on the Empire. The value of the Federation's war heroes should be maximized even after death. The funerals of Commander Zhong and his wife were held, as were the funerals of the soldiers who died on the ancient bell. However, Su Li's funeral was not mentioned due to the strong opposition of some people. The tentacles of the glory of the charter that passed through the space channel could no longer find Su Li's chip pulse, and determined that this person was dead. However, many people in the Federation were still waiting hopelessly for some kind of miracle to happen. But if miracles happen too many times, it couldn't be called a miracle. Different seasons passed on different planets, but there was still no news from the other side. In order to prepare for the grand space war that was about to begin, the Federation was making careful and intense preparations. Under such circumstances, under the strong pressure of the fanatical collective consciousness of the Federation people, many disputes were temporarily suppressed. Fatty Tian, Mad Manly, and the Crown Prince of the Tai family who were in the West Woods had to make all kinds of compromises. An atmosphere of harmony and sacrifice shrouded countless galaxies. At this moment, it was easy for some people to easily think of a certain person who seemed to never know how to compromise and didn't know how to look at the big picture. On the shore of Lake Feiqing, Jian Shuier, whose black hair cascaded down her shoulders like a waterfall, stood quietly in the morning light behind the old man who was standing in the morning light. After a long silence, she slightly raised her beautiful face, and with a trace of aura that was unknown whether it was inherited from her father or her birth mother, she said seriously, "I know why the Federal Fleet rejected my application, and I can also guess why you are so serious about preventing me from even having a slight chance to enter the Empire. It must be related to my background. There are many things that I don't understand about the military operation on planet 5460. Sula promised me to investigate it, so I didn't ask you. But now that he is dead, I think I should have the ability to ask directly like he did." Li Pifu, the god of war of the Federation, blinked his turbid eyes and looked up at the towering mountain on the other side of the lake. A meaningful smile appeared on his wrinkled face, as if he was somewhat gratified by the girl's courage to ask questions. However, he did not answer the question in the end. After a moment of silence, he changed the topic to another aspect. "I also have a question that I don't understand. How can a person like your father raise a child like Sulu? This revenge from morning to night should have nothing to do with his impulsive personality. It's just that sometimes even I don't understand the decisions he made. The child's actions are so calm, but why is the love and hate hidden under his face so obvious? I feel very sorry about his death." Li Pifu's face was calm as he said slowly in a serious tone, "I thought that in the years before my death, I would be able to watch him grow in a way that no one could have imagined, but I did not expect that he would die in front of me. However..." The old man quietly looked at Jian Shuier, whose face was slightly pale, and said, "All the people of the Federation who enter the Empire will undoubtedly die, but not him. Of course, it's just not necessarily." An asteroid shining with a metallic luster was suspended in the universe. This was the most important forward base of the Federation star field front line. It gathered the painstaking efforts of several generations of engineers of the Nutshell Company and consumed an astonishingly huge budget of the Federation government. At this moment, it was officially put into use. With this large information node as the hub, it connected all the information nodes in this spacious star field to the other end of the space channel, providing a strong support for the Federation's attack on the Empire. The 1st Regiment of the new 17th Division had been stationed in this giant space base for 3 months. Da Vinci, whose face was covered in grease, climbed out of the twisted tube of the W-type engine. He spat a mouthful of black saliva on the ground, took a cigarette box from his comrade, and lit it up. Then, he began to seriously compare the technical manual to see if he had missed anything during the previous maintenance. Ever since that day when they were trapped in the escape capsule and helplessly watched the 3-winged spaceship leave, the members of Group 7 had become much quieter than before. Even though they were now disbanded and returned to their respective combat units, they were still silent, but they trained even more seriously. Although the men on the battlefield had long been used to parting with life and death, this time felt a little different. Although that guy did not speak much and was even somewhat inconspicuous, it was still a little strange to not have such a leader who would charge at the front and retreat at the back. Da Vinci suddenly saw Bai Yulan's figure from the corner of his eyes. He immediately stood up and gave a standard military salute, then respectfully took out a cigarette and handed it over. Bai Yulan shook his head, and the black hair in front of his forehead suddenly swayed. His voice was a little cold. I quit smoking. For this outstanding military assassin, quitting smoking and relapsing had a kind of self-hypnotizing symbolic meaning. Since that guy had died irresponsibly, the number 37 brand cigarettes seemed to have become tasteless. Bai Yulan did not turn his head as he spoke. His left foot habitually retracted back as usual, and his head was slightly lowered. Under the cover of his black hair, his eyes were as sharp as knives as he stared at a certain spot. Over there, Shang Qiu was leading the staff of the Nutshell Engineering Department to carry out a complicated data calculation. This beautiful genius female engineer did not seem to have changed much from before. Her expression was calm, but her cheeks were a little thinner, which made her look even more delicate. These days, Shang Qiu was working non-stop. Other than that, there was nothing else. Under the long stone steps of Parliament Hill, the vice-chairman of the Green Dragon Mountain Committee, who had just finished a press conference and expressed his full support for the government's invasion of the empire, hurriedly left under the protection of the Special Task Force agents of the Federation. Zhang Xiaomeng, who was preparing to leave, was heavily surrounded by reporters. Madam Zhang Xiaomeng, do you have any thoughts on the unfortunate death of Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu? He's only missing. Zhang Xiaomeng paused for a moment, then calmly corrected them. The Federation is still unable to confirm his whereabouts. As for myself, I quite admire Lieutenant Colonel Su Li's heroic actions. As for the reflection of some people in the Federation on the so-called heroism, I think it's rather rude and retarded. It was rare to see this beautiful spokesperson of the Green Dragon Mountain, and it was rare to hear her positive comments. Naturally, the reporters were overjoyed, and countless questions flooded in. However, after Zhang Xiaoming's simple but direct comments, she didn't answer any more questions and walked into her office on Parliament Hill. The door to the office was tightly shut. Zhang Xiaoming sat quietly in the large chair. Her black-rimmed glasses were placed on the table. For a long time, she did not make a single sound or movement. Her body gradually loosened up, like a person who had worked hard for many days. Suddenly, she could no longer suppress the deep sense of fatigue in the depths of her body. This boring and hypocritical woman. In the Linyuan suburb of the capital special district, a young man and a young woman sat across the table from each other. They watched the scene in front of Parliament Hill that had just been broadcasted on the TV screen, and at the same time made the same disdainful comments. Then, the two of them were stunned at the same time. Shi Qinghai's charming peach blossom eyes flashed with a trace of luster. Under the accompaniment of the violin outside the restaurant, he said to the woman across the table, "You see, after all, we can still find many things in common. Don't you really want to consider it? Or, we can try to have some more intimate contact and find the feelings of youth. Although I'm already a mother, I've never felt that I'm old." Zhou Yu looked at him coldly and said, "What disgusts me is that you're still in the mood to chase a woman when we don't know whether that guy is dead or alive. Is the friendship between you men as disgusting as the friendship between those rich young ladies?" After saying this, she lowered her head and earnestly fed the delicate food into the little boy's mouth. Today, Zhou Yu wore a red, loose-flowing cloud dress. The smooth skin of her back revealed a large part of her beauty. As usual, there was a bright red flower in her hair, but it didn't look tacky at all. Shi Qinghai glanced at the little boy across the table who was as beautiful as a porcelain doll. He smiled slightly and immediately said with great sincerity, "It's because he's dead that I have to live well for him like I promised him before." After saying this, the two of them fell silent at the same time. Then, they began to drink continuously. The amber liquor was paired with 2 or 3 crystal ice cubes. Zhou Yu's eyebrows gradually blushed, which was extremely charming. Suddenly, she had an idea. She picked up 2 drops of liquor with the tip of her little finger and brought it to the little boy's lips. Zhou Liuhua, who had inherited his parents' excellent biological markers and stubborn temperament, had not yet mastered a rich vocabulary. Therefore, when they were outside, the little boy was always stubborn and refused to speak much. He curiously looked at the tip of his mother's finger that was brought to his lips and carefully stuck out his tongue to lick it. Zhou Yu felt a little ticklish, but her heart was filled with warmth. She smiled happily as she thought of the time when she was drunk in the nightclub. She used her cold appearance to hide her loneliness and unwillingness. Once again, she confirmed that giving birth to this little boy was the best thing she had done in her life. "You, what are you doing?" Shi Qinghai reprimanded somewhat angrily. Zhou Yu didn't pay attention to him at all. She just kept teasing her cute son who was frowning because of the spaciness, but refused to cry. Shi Qinghai couldn't help but feel a little bored. He said self-deprecatingly, "That's right. We are the sons of two drunkards. In the future, we will be drunkards too. Let me remind you again." Zhou Yu raised her head and stared at him. The charm on her beautiful face gradually disappeared. "The name on the column of Liuhua's father is Su Lu. I've never fought with a dead person for anything." Shi Qinghai spread out his hands. Suddenly, he said in a low voice, "But if this guy is still alive, fighting with him might be fun." The two of them fell silent again. Shi Qinghai thought for a long time and finally said, "I am a professional skeptic. From the beginning of the Macklin project until now, when the ancient bell was attacked, I feel that there is still a big problem. Brother Jiao. Secretary Jiao's suicide is indeed very suspicious. You better check the files. I will provide you with what I can." Zhou Yu didn't hesitate and replied, "But I believe that my father has nothing to do with this matter. And I have to remind you that the Bureau of Proclamation has already stopped the investigation. This matter may be more complicated than you think. We have to check eventually. It's just that in the past, there were two of us. Now that that guy is dead, I am the only one left. But I believe that if he could still speak, he would definitely shout, 'Continue the investigation. Continue the investigation.'" Mr. Scherf smiled and said, "That would really make him look like an idiot. But we can't let that idiot die in vain, right?" After hearing the word "die" so many times, Zhou Yu finally couldn't suppress her depressed mood anymore. She put down the wine glass and stared into Shi Qinghai's eyes. With her unique charm, she said, "He won't die even if you die 800 times. Maybe you know him better than I do." Shi Qinghai stood up and was ready to leave. He smiled and said, "You are right. That guy is either fighting or preparing for a fight. How could he die so easily? Maybe he is starting a new journey somewhere else." "Of course." Zhou Yu raised her beautiful face and said proudly, "You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure."